Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. Today you are going to watch what if Naruto was the puppet master of the Shinobi world. And before going to video, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe my channel.
No, the real reason I'm here is because of him. Naruto lazily pointed at the fake hunter Nin, who was in the process of picking up the sheets of paper strewn everywhere. Haku, said boy looked up in surprise to see Naruto lowering his arm and nodding with a congenial smile. Yes, if at all possible, I would like to spar with him. He seemed about my age, but very strong. I thought it would be a good test for me. There was a long moment of silence before Zabuza burst out laughing, an unpleasant, barking sound that grated on the ears. You came all this way, went through the trouble of finding this place, risking your own neck, all for a fight? He laughed again, leaning back on a crate and propping his hands on his blade's hilt. I think I'm beginning to like you, kid. His gaze shifted to his young apprentice. What do you say, Haku? Fancy a spar? The boy blinked, surprised at being given the choice as he looked over at the blonde. He was in the process of bringing his hood back over his hair. Just a spar? Naruto grinned with his eyes closed, his hands coming up placating. The gesture seemed less sincere when his jacket covered up said hands to hide the movements of his fingers. Just a spar, all friendly. I won't even use my lethal poisons. Haku blinked. He had never really had a friendly spar with somebody of his own age group. Being on the run with Zabuza never allowed for it. After a moment of consideration, the edges of his lips quirked up and he nodded slowly, causing Naruto's grin to grow. Excellent. Naruto bounced on his feet lightly, cracking his neck as he stood opposite Haku with a small smirk growing on his face. He felt excited. This would be the first time he could really test himself against someone other than Sasuke. The Uchiha was no fun because Naruto mostly knew what to expect. Haku was new, exciting, and unpredictable, and Naruto relished the challenge of the unknown. To his side, Ramius silently swayed. He figured it would be best to have her out, as the surprise wouldn't work on Haku anyway, the boy having seen the snake-based puppet before. All right, get ready. Naruto felt his muscles tense, and he could barely keep his fingers from twitching as Zabuza set them off from the side of the clearing. They were lucky Zabuza's hideout was so far from Tezuna's house, or this wouldn't have been possible. Go. Zabuza's arm came down, and immediately both boys leapt into action in their own way. Haku sprang forward, his speed momentarily catching Naruto off guard before the blonde recovered, and his hidden fingers became a blur of motion. Ramiya swept in front of him, her body coiling around his own as the wooden construct took the hail of steel sunbond that appeared in Haku's hands for fractions of a second. They did little to Ramiya's tough skin, and soon the puppet could respond in kind as its long, sharply clawed fingers suddenly detached from the hands. They flew outward toward the young Yuki, kept tethered to the puppet by long, prehensile cables that were textured like a carpenter's file along the sides. If they scraped across Haku's skin, they would easily tear through, leaving a large dose of poison in his bloodstream. Just because Naruto wasn't trying to be lethal didn't mean he discounted paralytics and muscle relaxants. The boy immediately sensed the danger and leapt away from the wildly whipping cables, knocking them off course with surprising ease using pinpoint Senbon throws. Naruto's eyes narrowed in focus as he continued to manipulate Ramiya into at least capturing the boy. However, he was surprised as what appeared to be a large 2-meter by 1-meter thin block of ice rose from the ground in front of the Yuki, to which the boy immediately dived into. For a moment, the blonde was so shocked by the unusual tactic that his fingers went slack, stopping Ramiya in her tracks. A moment later, and he winced as a small barrage of icy Senbon began to litter his body. Ramiya being wrapped around him protected his vitals, but he did feel his left arm begin to cramp up, which was a bad thing considering he really needed his arms. Deciding he had left this fight out in the open too long, Naruto surprised Haku, wherever he was hiding, by suddenly using Ramiya as a springboard. She crouched down, tensing, and the moment he stepped on her shoulder she uncoiled, launching the boy high into the air. Now with an aerial view, Naruto grinned as he spotted Haku hiding in the trees. He directed Ramiya over to his position before landing on a tree branch himself, immediately moving further into the forestry. Suddenly, It was the Yuki put on the defensive as the boy found himself dodging vicious tail strikes that easily smashed through sturdy tree trunks. Ramia wasn't a slow puppet by any means, and her reptilian lower body allowed a range of movements that were both unpredictable and unexpected. It only got worse for Haku as the puppet began unleashing small salvos of what he immediately recognized to be medicinal senbon. Fortunately for him, they were much thinner and flimsier than his combat-grade ones and didn't fly perfectly straight through the air. This made them easier to dodge and their movements easier to predict. It also made them more difficult to see, and more than a few times the boy felt a breeze as they shot past. All the while he couldn't find Naruto, the boy seemingly having blended himself into the surroundings despite Haku, knowing he should have been somewhere nearby. Haku panicked briefly as the tree he was on suddenly toppled due to Ramia's extending claws ripping through the base. As he fell, he glanced down to see the length of Ramia's tail open in its entirety. Where the last time he had seen this happen it had been filled to the brim with kunai, it was now stuffed with senbon. This presented an entirely new range of danger as the senbon could be more tightly packed, resulting in there being hundreds more. Evidently, this was supposed to be impossible to avoid, but Haku surprised Naruto by once again creating another of his ice mirrors and, mid-fall, managing to angle his body into it. The hail of glinting weaponry hit nothing but tree bark and the backside of the slowly melting ice construct. It was only Naruto's instincts that saved him as he rolled off the underside of the branch he was hiding under, watching in surprise as a small line of senbon implanted themselves where he had just been. Moments later, at speeds Naruto couldn't hope to match, Haku appeared below him, catching him with a kick to the chin that launched him further into the forest before rolling to a stop in a slightly more open clearing. Before he could catch his wind, or his bearings, he found himself surrounded by a dome of those same annoying ice mirrors. "I'm afraid this is where the spar ends, Naruto-san. This is my ultimate technique," Haku's emotionless voice intoned as he stepped into the mirrors, appearing like a reflection in all of them. Despite that, Naruto could detect the hint of amusement in his tone. The blonde grunted as he cracked his neck, but there was an undeniable smile on his features as his fingers worked furiously. As much as his body hurt, he couldn't deny that this entire experience wasn't exhilarating. He had no intention of stopping here. "I'm afraid I have no ultimate techniques, Haku-san. You'll just have to put up with this." Thankful his enemy was one he could keep talking, Naruto's smile broadened as Ramia suddenly burst through one of the mirrors, shattering it like glass as her full bulk crashed right through the sturdy construct. Haku wasted no time in both regenerating the lost mirror and launching a wave of his signature weapon at the blonde. Naruto managed to surprise him once again, though as Ramia wrapped around his form, the compartment previously filled to the brim with senbon opening up to allow him to climb inside. Suddenly, and for the first time, Haku found somebody trapped within her ice dome that he couldn't touch. He launched hundreds of hastily made senbon he created with his Hayatan chakra, but they all either bounced off Ramia's sturdy body or missed because of the puppet's constantly swaying motions. Haku could already feel the draining effect of his jutsu setting in, so he began quickly leaving the mirrors, flashing between them at undetectable speeds to slash at the puppet's joints instead. This seemed to have a much greater effect as Ramia began to lock up, a moment later ejecting the blonde puppeteer inside. Haku wasted no time as she peppered the boy with needles, to the point where he looked as though he had been forced through an entire acupuncture session. Only once he was motionless on the ground did Haku breathe a sigh of relief, cautiously approaching the boy and keeping a wary eye on his puppet. It was this caution that allowed Haku to barely spot the tiniest flashes of blue light reflected in one of her slowly melting mirrors and jump back into one, just as the Naruto on the ground exploded into a hail of senbon like some kind of human flechette round. Safe behind his mirrors, Haku quickly spotted the blonde hiding behind Ramia and flashed into the dome, holding a senbon directly to the boy's neck in a much less steady grip than a few minutes before. Both boys were breathing a lot heavier, exhaustion and fatigue beginning to set in, but both had their own smiles on their face as Naruto finally raised his hands. "Okay, I surrender." When Haku took the senbon away, Naruto happily leant against his puppet, regulating his breathing as he grinned. I thought I had you there at the end. He had kept the shattered body of Dami after fighting Sasuke, just in case. And while it was now useless as a puppet, he could still apply a hinge to it, hoping to catch somebody off guard. Haku just smiled as the dome around them melted away, revealing Zabuza standing just outside, an intrigued Lu on his bandaged face. It was close, I admit, was the only response he got from the Yuki, as he too caught his breath. The blonde had given him quite the runaround in the forest. Well, it was certainly interesting to watch. I'll give you kids that. Zabuza decided to weigh in, Kubi Karibaku slung over one shoulder casually. But as fun as it's been, I'm afraid this is going to have to be goodbye. If those letters you showed me are true, the Hunter Nin are right on our trail. We're going to have to leave now to build up a suitable lead again. Naruto just nodded understandingly as he straightened up and sealed Ramia away into a quickly hidden scroll. Fair enough, I still enjoyed the opportunity. He offered his hand to Haku, who shook it politely with a small grin. Likewise, I hope we can meet again when both our abilities have matured. Naruto nodded, deciding that he would enjoy that. Zabuza, on the other hand, just gave a barking laugh as he grabbed Naruto's hand rather roughly. Count me in for that. You two are going to be damn strong, I can already tell. Naruto again smiled at the praise. He was unused to it, and it felt good. Despite many in his village recognizing his skill as prodigious, it was only reluctantly said, and never where they thought he could overhear. Good luck then, Naruto offered, before watching Zabuza and Haku quickly take their leave. He took a few more moments to collect himself, make sure there was as little evidence of the conflict as possible, and left. He found Tsunami exactly where he had left her, drugged in an alleyway in the village proper, and quickly gave her the countertoxin. Ah, Era? What happened? The poor housewife looked about in confusion as she returned to the waking world only to see Naruto looking down at her with a concerned expression. Are you all right, Tsunami-san? Naruto offered with all the sincerity he could muster. When I came to help you with shopping, you collapsed in the street. I took you over here to rest, but you still look rather flushed. Tsunami shook her head a few times, trying to clear it off the fog that had descended over her thoughts, before smiling. I think I should be fine now. Thank you for the concern, Naruto-san. You're such a nice young boy. Naruto smiled at her as he offered his hand to help her up. Are you sure, Tsunami-san? You can never be too careful. The woman just smiled at him, as if to dissuade his concerns. I'm fine now, Naruto. Now let's go back to the house. I'm sure my family and your team are worried about us. She began to walk off, missing Naruto's much less innocent smile as he followed after her. Of course, of course. Haku and Zabuza quickly sped through the trees on their way out of Nami no Kuni, only briefly stopping when they needed to get some water. As they did so, Haku noticed Zabuza still wore a grin underneath his face wrap. Naruto-san was interesting, wasn't he? Haku offered, to break the strange silence that had come over them since leaving. Yeah, interesting Gaki, all right, especially for a Konoha brat. I was surprised he came so close to actually beating you. Haku smiled at Zabuza's gruff assertion as he pulled up his sleeve slightly, revealing a small scratch down his forearm. Actually, I believe if Naruto-san were taking me more seriously, the outcome would have been very different. It had taken a lot for Haku to fight despite his arm being partially numbed. Zabuza took one look at the small wound that would have been easily enough for a lethal poison to get into Haku's system before laughing loudly, looking down at the small note Naruto had slipped him in their handshake. Like I said, Haku, interesting kid. A young, mousy-haired man cautiously walked into the old warehouse on the edge of town that had been abandoned shortly after Gatsu took over the nation. He breathed a sigh of relief as he spotted others already there, milling about and quietly talking amongst themselves. From the number of people there, he could only assume he was one of the last to arrive, and was proven right shortly after. The previously darkened and dimly lit warehouse suddenly erupted in light as somebody turned the power on. Most people winced at the sudden change, but those that had only just arrived, whose eyes hadn't adjusted, gasped at what they saw. Suspended from the ceiling of the massive building was none other than Gatsu, his arms held out to either side by the wires supporting him. The man was obviously still alive, but his previously nice and well-tailored clothing was torn and dirted, his face bruised and bloodied. When everybody else realized what they were seeing, the entire warehouse erupted into excited and shocked chatter as people tried to work out what was going on and just who had done this. Do you like my present? Abruptly, all the conversations died as a loud but casual voice spoke up over all of them. It was quickly revealed to belong to a hooded individual sitting in a darker corner of the warehouse, his features mostly shrouded by the gloom. "What is this?" A braver resident of the nation called out to the shrouded figure, only to have him cock his head slightly. "Like I said, it is my present to the people of Nami no Kuni, Gatu, of Gata Shipping and Transport, delivered to you so that you can see justice done." The warehouse erupted into whispers and voices again, and the figure seemed perfectly content to allow them to continue until the same man called out again. "We were told Gata left the country." The figure in the darkness just smiled, his white teeth visible even in the darkened corner. "And yet he's right here, above you all. How curious." The man seemed to fall quiet at that, as none of the collected people seemed to have anything to say. They were all only here because of notes subtly distributed around the village, telling them that if they came here at this time, they would be rewarded. "Is this the change?" A woman spoke up from near the back of the hall, holding up a small white note most of the assembled recognized. The figure smiled again, nodding once in confirmation. "That was you?" Another voice, and another nod to answer him before silence descended again and the figure finally deigned to speak. "This is a turning point for your nation. As I see it, there are a few directions you could take your newfound freedom, none of which are easy." There were a few more whispers at that, but they quietened down quickly as the figure raised a hand. He had already earned their undivided attention. "You could try and build your nation up to what it once was, but with the financial instability created under Gata's regime, it would be difficult. Eventually, you would need loans from a larger nation, and suddenly you would be placing yourself under a different kind of slavery, one of debt." Again, the crowd broke out in nervous chatter, and the man simply waited for them to quieten. "You could also try to seize Gata's assets. Try and live your way through that," he continued patiently. "Although I assure you, the man was quite brilliant in hiding what he owned. You wouldn't get far." This time there was silence, and the figure smiled. "Thirdly, you could abandon Nami. Try to make a life for yourself elsewhere. With the completion of Tizuna's bridge, this will become a real possibility. Personally, though, I see this as the coward's way out." Finally, somebody in the crowd was brave enough to speak out in a frustrated tone. "Then what would you suggest?" The Cheshire-like grin hidden in the shadows only grew as the figure suddenly stepped out into the light, but still drawn so they couldn't see his face. However, many instantly recognized from his height that he couldn't be all that old. "I'm glad you asked. I know the way to return Nami to its original glory without you ever once having to ask for the support of another nation. As long as you agree to give me a 0.1% share of the nation's earnings, a trifling amount, I can give you this knowledge." The people looked amongst themselves nervously. This suddenly felt like making a deal with the devil. They were a nation of fishermen and farmers, though, and anybody who was a threat to Gatu had already been killed off, leaving nobody qualified to lead the nation. "You're just a kid." The figure didn't see who called out, but he seemed unconcerned by it nevertheless. "A kid that currently owns majority share in Gata Shipping and Transport. It would be simple enough to dilute my stock amongst the nation, giving you all the money you needed to rebuild." That seemed to quieten the man, only for another to speak up. "If you have that, why give it to us for so little in return?" In truth, 0.1% of their entire country's earnings was hardly a small amount, but it paled in comparison to a company like Gata's. "Because, admittedly, there is something else I want in return. Information. Nami will quickly become a hub of shipping lanes and trade lines. A lot of information will pass through here." He smiled serenely as he leaned against a large, long-abandoned crate. "And that is all I ask. Nami no Kuni will be back to its former strength within a year. Guaranteed." They looked uncertain and spoke in hushed, nervous whispers, but the figure already knew what their decision would be. His cards were on the table, and they had seen their choices. It had already happened. They just didn't know it yet. Naruto opened the door to his apartment and stepped through with a thoughtful expression. His mind was a hive of activity as he instinctually stepped over old cups of ramen and a broken, disused puppet he had never gotten around to shifting. He collapsed into the comfy swivel chair he had managed to find out behind the apartment block and kept in front of his workbench. Right now, his eyes weren't on the odd mechanisms and stray puppet components strewn across the wooden surface, but staring blankly ahead, wrapped up in his own thoughts. The mission to Wave had certainly been both an eye-opening and enlightening experience in many aspects. In truth, it was his very first mission, D-ranks excluded for obvious reasons, and it had taught him many things he didn't know. He had learned what was necessary and unnecessary on missions, and would begin to organize his pockets and sealing scrolls accordingly. He would also begin to carry around sealing scrolls capable of carrying human bodies so a bounty wouldn't slip through his fingers. With the new arrangement with Nami no Kuni, he now wasn't exactly hurting for money. On the contrary, he would soon have more than he knew what to do with, but it couldn't hurt to be prepared. On a similar vein, having both Ramia and Dami destroyed on the same mission told him that he either needed to get faster at fixing his puppets, or he needed to bring spares. He wouldn't always have the grace of a few days between conflicts, and, as Sasuke's fight with him had shown, he only had limited uses without his puppeteering. He absently looked down at the Sunbon launcher on his wrist, another thing he would be upgrading and working with due to how effective it had shown to be, making up for his body's limitations. He would also be upgrading all his puppets to include Sunbon after seeing how effective they had made Ramia. The other eye-opening fight was with Haku. The boy had beaten him, the very first time Naruto had tasted defeat. He couldn't say he was disappointed by it, though. Under different circumstances it may have been fatal, but as a friendly spar it simply pointed out his flaws. Namely, it brought to light his body's weakness and his dependence on puppets. Training in taijutsu would surely fix that, but, to be honest, Naruto wasn't one for physical exertion. He would rather find another way to overcome this particular problem. He left his mind to mull it over in the background as it moved on to more relevant thoughts. That brought Naruto up to his final and possibly largest revelation, his new information network. A grin slowly spread his cheeks as he suddenly pushed off his workbench, spinning about on his chair in his excitement. He couldn't believe he had actually done it. His very first mission, and he actually had managed to build a small, effective network of spies. Sure, it was in its infancy, and currently he couldn't exactly control what information was brought to him. But once again Naruto trusted that he would come to learn the best way to handle it, as he always had done. Naruto groaned piteously into his hands, slumping forward to lay his head against the workbench. It hadn't been used as such in a while. Right now, it was stacked with books on politics, economics, and business management. They were subjects Naruto had a decent grasp of thanks to the academy, but apparently not to the level where he could manage an entire country. He groaned again and slowly banged his head into the wood. It had been almost 2 weeks since the mission to Nami, and Naruto only found his workload growing by the day. At the time, he thought it ingenious to have his spies deliver him his information and money through the deliveries between Nami and Konoha that had started up again once the bridge was completed. What he hadn't expected was for them to bring him everything. Report after report built up on his desk, and he just couldn't handle it all. He was only 13. He honestly felt as though he had bitten off more than he could chew here. All the same, though, he suffered through the sleepless nights, as he had done through the academy, and he bore with it. He could only hope that it would get better. He was suffering. He hadn't even had the chance to make any of the modifications to his puppets that he wanted, nor could he even really practice much. His fingers were used to directing dangerous and deadly puppets, not writing business reports and economic statements. Naruto had a natural flair for on-the-fly planning and tactics. Long-term strategy was never a particularly strong suit of his. The shadows under his eyes were only growing, and he was becoming increasingly irritable with his lack of sleep, or at least his greater lack of sleep than usual. He needed help, but it wasn't as though he could simply walk up to the Hokage and tell him he had decided to take over Nami no Kuni on what amounted to a whim, and now he was buckling under the workload. No, he needed discreet help from somebody who wouldn't divulge his secrets, someone who could be trusted. Arc. In his frustration, Naruto sent a pile of documents crashing to the floor, breathing heavily as he just stared at the now scattered pages like his gaze could set them on fire. The people he knew and had any extended interaction with could be counted on both hands. the ones he could implicitly trust? There weren't any. Naruto had a guarded heart and didn't put his trust out there so easily. So far, none had met the expectations. He sighed morosely as he began picking the sheets back up, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Perhaps if he brought his concerns to the people of Nami he had recruited? No, that wouldn't work. Not after he had swooped in and saved them. He needed to maintain an image of being in control and that he knew what he was doing. It would have been perfect if only he actually did know what he was doing. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and let out a small yawn as he dumped the stack back on his workbench, now a glorified desk. Okay, maybe not somebody he trusted, but somebody shy who, like him, didn't interact much with people and couldn't give away what he was doing. They would have to be intelligent, but naive and trusting themselves. A political background would be ideal so they would actually know what they were doing and this wouldn't all be pointless. A clan child perhaps. His graduating year was full of them, however none that he had a great deal of interaction with. Ideally, he would want a clan deeply embroiled in the village's politics, like the Yamanaka or the Hyuga. Hiya. Hinata viciously struck at the training post, watching with concentrated, determined eyes as parts of the wooden pole splintered away at the touch of her chakra-laced fingers. Again she struck it, vicious accuracy in each of her strikes. A palm thrust tore another chunk off the side, and she watched in her enhanced visual state, the veins around her eyes bulging slightly, as each individual fragment of wood flew off like the beads of sweat on her forehead. Her footing changed as she shifted positions, lashing out to the side and taking another strip of wood for her effort, before finally coming full circle and striking the post with a double-palmed hit that contained all of her recent frustrations. She had to become stronger, for her team, for her father, for her sister, for him. She lashed out again, trying to clear her mind with physical exertion, but it stuck with her. She had heard the news about what had happened in Nami from Kiba, who in turn had heard it from Ino. Running into dangerous missing Nin, having to help free a nation, all things she believed Naruto could do, but she herself felt so helpless for being unable to keep up. She could see him running ahead of her, only ever seeming to get farther away while she wallowed in the shade. So this is the prowess of the Byakugan and the famous Jukin? A very familiar and very unexpected voice cut into her internal thoughts. Sure enough, when she suddenly whirled around, Naruto was watching her from the branch of a tree with a small smile. A smile Hinata had always wanted to see directed her way. Now that it was, she found her thoughts becoming a jumbled mess. Her cheeks flaming up and becoming red and her hands nervously coming together in front of her, her fingers twiddling absently. Naruto-kun, she squeaked, her Byakugan deactivating, for all the help it had done her noticing him when she was so focused on her own thoughts and the post in front of her. Speaking of which, I never realized it could be this vicious. Confused, Hinata turned to look at the post, only to widen her eyes in surprise. The thick wooden pole was practically shredded, shards of wood and dust littering the ground around it, while the top half hung limp and pathetic by a few straining flakes of bark. Hinata found that if she averted her gaze a bit, it became slightly easier. A moment later, and Naruto was right in front of her, still regarding her with that easy, seldom-seen smile. His hood was down, which was also a rarity in the academy, and Hinata was briefly entranced by the way his hair swayed slightly in the wind. Yes, Naruto-kun, she finally managed, not without a great deal of effort. However, the boy seemed more amused than anything. Actually, Hinata, I had come to find you and ask for your help, but if you're busy training. He trailed off and turned to go only for Hinata's body to act on reflex and grab his hand. When she realized what she had done, she quickly released it like it was burning hot. No, I am not busy, she uttered in a quiet and withdrawn voice. What do you need help with, Naruto-kun? Internally, she was rather proud for achieving that much. Naruto seemed to regard her for a moment, and she bit her lip tersely before he smiled and turned back to her, allowing her to breathe an internal sigh of relief. All right, if you insist. He started in a casual tone, his hands moving a bit for effect. I actually recently decided that I needed a goal for the future beyond becoming an excellent shinobi. I'm not really one to settle though, so I figured, why not aim for the top and try to become Hokage? Hinata nodded enthusiastically at that. her hands gripping the front of her bulky jacket. She could see him do it and knew he had it in him. She had always admired that, even through what she saw as unfair treatment and attitudes towards him. Naruto had never given up. He had just quietly soldiered on until she even heard people begin to call him a prodigy. Hinata knew better, though. She knew just how hard Naruto must work for everything he did. He saw it in the hands he bandaged up to cover his training injuries. In the shadows under his eyes others might see as unattractive, she only saw his dedication and perseverance. He even went so far as to harm his body, as she had seen when she occasionally watched him in his apartment experimenting with poisons for his puppets. She wished for the past few years to have even a shred of that determination. "I think you could do it," she uttered, for a minute thinking that Naruto hadn't heard her until he smiled bashfully. "That makes one person at least. I told the Hokage, and he set me some kind of test, likely just as busy work to keep me occupied, so I can't pester him." He laughed to himself, but Hinata caught the twinkle of disappointment in his eye, and it immediately made her stand up a little straighter. "Is that what you need my help with?" Naruto seemed to snap out of it and turned back to her, a bright grin spreading over his features that almost instantly set Hinata's face aflame and her heart into flutters. "Actually, yeah. I'm still not used to a lot of this political stuff, and I thought someone like you, with a background in a big clan like the Hyuga, might have a better grasp of it. All I really need is some insight, or a few pointers, but I mean, if you don't think..." Naruto was both surprised and cut off as Hinata quickly interjected. "I can do it." Her eyes were screwed shut and her hands were balled into fists just in front of her as she practically forced the words out, before cracking open her pale eyes and immediately looking down, suddenly embarrassed over her outburst. I think I can do it." Her hands came up, and she gently poked her index fingers together, finding Naruto's vibrant blue eyes difficult to meet. "That's great, Hinata. What do you think of these?" When she looked up again, Naruto was holding a small bundle of papers. Even a cursory glance told her they looked rather complicated. However, they at least seemed familiar, similar to the ones she was forced to read over and over as a child, and continued to as her father fervently tried to prepare her for her role as the clan head. If she was honest with herself, though, as much as she would like to try and unite the two branches of her family, her younger but more promising sister would likely take the position. Well, they don't seem too complicated, Naruto-kun. She looked at them again, finding a blend of financial reports, various statements from businesses, and other such documents associated with managing a city or even a small country. Hokage-sama gave you these? Naruto quickly nodded, running a sheepish hand through his spike locks and causing Hinata's eyes to glaze slightly at the almost Bishin in action. She could honestly say it was more than just Naruto's determination that she felt drawn to. "Yeah, apparently he made up some hypothetical country or something and asked me to manage it as though it were real." He explained, only to have Hinata nod absently as she flipped through them. "I'm sure he's just trying to keep me busy, but I still want to do it to the best of my ability, you know?" In her concentration, she missed Naruto's eyes narrow ever so slightly before returning to their previous warm appearance. Really, she was just amazed at the Hokage's dedication to detail, even if it was just busy work. Then again, she shouldn't be underestimating the village's leader. Well, if this is all, then I think I should be able to help you, Naruto-kun." She nodded to affirm her statement as she handed Naruto back the stack of papers. It was all worth it, if only for the beaming smile he gave her. "Thanks a lot, Hinata. That's a load off my mind. If I want to be Hokage, then failure's not an option, right?" He smiled again as she gave another hurried nod. Her fingers had stopped fidgeting at some point, and throughout the conversation, she seemed to become more open, like a turtle emerging from its shell. "Because of this, if there's ever something you need help with, don't hesitate to ask me, okay?" He gave her a quick grin as she nodded her agreement and turned to leave, disappointing the blue-haired Hyuga slightly. However, he took a few steps only to turn back, as if thinking better of it. "Oh, and could you not tell the Hokage about this? I don't want him to know I had help. Okay." When he spoke, he had such a warm and welcoming smile Hinata couldn't help but melt as she found her eyelids becoming lidded, her head nodding on its own. "Of course, Naruto-kun." She got the fright of her life as Naruto suddenly moved toward her, far closer than he had ever been before. making her cheeks redden immediately. It didn't end there, though. After what seemed like a moment of hesitation on his part, he leaned in and quickly wrapped his arms around her in a brief hug. That finally proved to be a bit too much for the Hyuga heiress, and, by the time he let go, her body had gone slack and fell limply to the ground, a dazed but intensely satisfied grin occupying her lips. Naruto stepped back from the collapsed girl, a worried look briefly passing over his features before he realized she was actually unconscious. The look slipped from his face to show his usual impassive mask, his cold, lidded eyes glancing over the girl before smirking down at the papers in his hands. That was far too easy. The young puppeteer lay on the rail of the little red bridge that ran over the small stream through Training Ground 3. He, Sakura, and Sasuke were currently waiting on their chronically late sensei for their daily training or mission. After the debacle in Nami no Kuni, they had briefly been demoted to D ranks once more, but Naruto was sure they would be back on the good missions soon enough. He had been making sure their team dynamic was as good as it could be, so Kakashi had little reason to keep them away from C ranks. Normally, in this situation, he would be tinkering with some small mechanism, or going through one of his many dexterity exercising like flipping a Rio coin through his fingers. Right now, though, his mind was far too abuzz with activity for such mundane tasks, so he had instead taken to resting his head in his hands and looking up at the sky as he mulled them over. It did somewhat irk him that he seemed to be doing far more thinking than, well, doing lately. Hinata had been a massive help in organizing Nami no Kuni, suggesting he begin to delegate various tasks within the spy network, although she didn't know it as such, to others. He had taken this on board and created a kind of hierarchy within the group through repeated correspondence using the merchant caravan method. It was fairly reliable, as trips between Konoha and Nami only took a few hours, and the caravans came in a near constant stream, making their round trips. Currently, all of the information he received from the country was routed through a woman called Rakai, a housewife before Gadu had her husband and eldest son killed for being unable to pay their taxes. She had been elected as somewhat of an intermediary between Nami and him even before the reorganization, as she had been a well-known activist within the village during Gadu's regime. She would do the best she could to provide orphans and other runaways board for the night using the money hidden by her late husband. Naruto rather admired her ability to continue helping her country during the nation's strife and had been glad to take her on as a direct subordinate. Now she was the one organizing what information was or was not relevant to him, which took a great deal of pressure off his shoulders. He couldn't exactly say he trusted the woman, but he knew that she knew that he was the best hope for their country. At that moment, though, his thoughts were derailed as Kakashi appeared on the bridge uncharacteristically early, a rather unwarranted smile crinkling his eye as he looked at his assembled students. Instantly, Naruto was drawn to the slips of paper he was carrying as the man hopped off the railing. "Good morning, everyone. I know this may be a bit sudden, but I've entered you all for the Chunin exams." He took a moment to take in Sakura's shocked expression as well as Naruto and Sasuke's interested looks. "These are the application forms you need to fill out. Don't worry, though. It's a completely voluntary affair. If you don't feel ready, then there's no pressure for you to participate." He flourished the slips a moment as he regarded each of his genin in turn. Sasuke was sure to want to enter. He would naturally see this as a challenge that he needed to overcome. As much as Kakashi hated to agree with Naruto on these things, the boy was a tad predictable. Sakura, he also believed, would enter. No doubt she would agonize over it for a while, but she would come to the conclusion that advancing to Chunin would be the only way to stay with Sasuke. Naruto, on the other hand, he was, and continued to be, an enigma for the usually perceptive jounin. Normally, he would say the boy would be thrilled to have an opportunity to not only advance, but also show off his puppeteering. Ever since the mission to Nami no Kuni, he just wasn't sure what to make of the boy anymore. He seemed even more secretive than usual, drawing away from the team where before he had been slowly integrating more and more into it. Kakashi would give up one of his Ika books to know what was going through that boy's mind. Hell, he wasn't even sure if the blown even wanted to get promoted. He seemed more interested in simply developing his art. Contrary to Kakashi's beliefs, at that moment Naruto couldn't be more excited, a hidden grin spreading over his lips as he took the application form. This represented a great opportunity for him, as the Chunin exams were an international event. He would finally be able to show the world his hard work. Who knew? Maybe even Sasori himself might take notice. The thought alone was enough to make Naruto eager. What's more, with the situation in Nami settling, it presented a wonderful opportunity to test himself like he used to. He nodded to himself slowly as he left the bridge, Kakashi having vanished off to wherever that man tended to go, most likely to read his smut. He would need to build a new puppet, one equal to Ramia in ability. This would finally give him the push he needed to learn how to manipulate Ramia fully with only on hand. Sure, he only had a week to do it, but Naruto always worked best under pressure. As he walked down the street, his mind already patching together ideas he had already had in the past and never gotten around to acting on, he felt a chill run down his spine. Looking up, he immediately spotted the cause in the form of a young boy around his age with rusty red hair and the coldest set of teal eyes he had ever seen. It was hard for his attention not to be drawn that way, due to the boy's small stature and the comically large gourd he was carrying over his shoulder. There was also the small fact he appeared to have the kanji for love tattooed above his left eye in what could be mistaken for blood at first glance. The headband of Suna wrapped around the gourd gave away his allegiances, and at the sight of the engraved hourglass symbol, he felt something in his blood stir. Sunagakure, the original and supposedly only users of the puppeteering ninja arts in the elemental nations. As they passed by, the red-haired boy not giving him a second glance, Naruto couldn't help but smirk. Wouldn't Suna be surprised come this Chunin exams? However, as he passed by, he seemed to catch the eye of a boy just behind the redhead. He was dressed up in a full-body suit and, most noticeable, had purple markings over his features. The war paint seemed a bit archaic, but Naruto ignored that in favor of the wrapped bundle slung over his back and the fingerless gloves he wore. Then it was over, and the two passed one another, Naruto returning his attention to the road and the boy returning a rather more nervous gaze to the boy with the gourd and the older girl walking next to them. For the first time in a long time, though, Naruto felt the stirrings of anticipation build within him. The Chunin exams had seemed inviting before. Now he couldn't wait. Sakura tittered nervously in front of Naruto's apartment door for a few minutes, occasionally bringing her hand up to knock only to hesitate and begin pacing again. This would be the first time entering a boy's home. She had always wanted that privilege to go to Sasuke, but he always rebuked her attempts to get closer. She was also a little unnerved about how quiet Naruto's apartment building was. She had expected signs of other residents, but there was nothing. It was almost as though the entire place was abandoned. The only reason she was even here was because this was the third consecutive day that Naruto had missed team training and she had finally been sent over to get him. HSE hesitated, because Naruto unnerved her at the best of times, freaking her out at the worst. Although in that respect she supposed he was a bit like Shino. She eventually mustered the courage to knock, only to hear sudden clattering from inside followed by the sound of too many bolts being drawn back before Naruto finally cracked the door open. That was another reason he weirded Sakura out. He always seemed so paranoid and guarded, yet at random moments he would suddenly open up and become amicable. It was like he could turn on normal human emotions at the flip of some internal switch and go from withdrawn and introverted to easygoing and friendly. Sometimes Sakura swore that Naruto didn't even know what he wanted to be feeling, and it was just confusing at the best of times. "Oh, Sakura," he greeted a little awkwardly as he rubbed his slightly bloodshot eyes. Hey." His eyes seemed to have gained even deeper shadows than normal in the time she hadn't seen him. "What's up?" he finally offered, somewhat lamely in Sakura's opinion, as he fully opened the door. Immediately, Sakura screwed her nose up as she saw the clutter that lined his floor. Old ramen tubs, which was evidently a favorite of Naruto's given the boy was holding one right now and seemed to be in the middle of eating, as well as random bits of wood or metal littered the floor randomly. "What do you mean, what's up? You missed 3 days of team training." Sakura finally lost her temper, forgetting her earlier hesitance once she saw that Naruto didn't even seem to have a valid reason beyond just not coming. "I'm here to get you, Baka." The boy just blinked before leaning out of the apartment and looking out one of the windows in the hall. "Oh, right," he once again offered without much energy, and looking into his apartment, Sakura could see why. He had all his blinds and curtains closed, so not a drop of natural light entered the place. It was no wonder he seemed so tired all the time and had no semblance of a natural sleep cycle if he spent so long in this place. It would also explain why he was so inexplicably pale, considering they lived in one of the sunniest nations on the continent, barring Kaze no Kuni. What have you even been doing all this time? She couldn't believe Naruto hadn't slept in 3 days, so he must have had some semblance or notion he was missing out on things. If he did, he didn't seem too upset by it. All she got for her trouble was a lame shrug as the boy slipped back into the apartment, preparing for the Chunin exams. It was only as he turned that Sakura noticed the nasty-looking red markings running down one of his arms and partway up his neck. They looked like a terrible rash, but they were far too defined from the skin to be that. Sakura's medical training let her know that much. What? By poisoning yourself? After beginning the process of learning medical ninjutsu and the knowledge that came with it, many of Naruto's absences and following appearances back at the academy made a lot more sense to her. The blonde just shrugged as if it was no big deal what he was doing to his body. Among other things, Sakura just gaped as she followed him into the apartment, her earlier reservations pushed to the side by her shock. Anything she might have said was immediately forgotten as she stepped into what she supposed was once a living room. She had known even in the academy that Naruto had a somewhat unhealthy obsession with his puppeteering, but it only really hit her then. Pages of drawings and schematics littered the walls and floor, cluttering up what appeared to be a workbench in the corner of the room. Why you made all this? Sakura had never been more creeped out in her life as she looked about the various puppets hanging from the walls, the ceiling, and anywhere else Naruto could fit them. She could literally see the progression of his art as their faces and bodies became more defined and detailed, the woodwork becoming smoother and more professional. A few she even recognized from when he would sneak them into the taijutsu spars in the academy, only to get caught by the instructor. Huh. Naruto looked up, noodles dangling from his mouth as he quickly pulled on his jacket, flipping the hood up in a practiced motion so that a few locks of blonde hair hung out and shaded his eyes. Oh, yeah. Feel free to look around, I guess, he managed, after slurping up the food in his mouth. He obviously wasn't one for manners. As he went about collecting the things he would need, Sakura found her gaze drifting about, at least until her eyes fell on a particular puppet. Like most of the others, it seemed only half-finished, suspended by wires as it gathered dust in a corner, apparently not having been touched in a while. Like Naruto's other combat puppet, it had a sort of half-woman, half-animal theme to it, with the body and face of a woman, although they were rather grotesque in their half-complete form, and the features of a bird. It only had one wing, though, and the opposite leg, giving it a malformed, misshapen look that made it stand out from the others. What happened to that one? As unsettling as she found Naruto sometimes, he didn't seem like the type to simply give up on things. He always seemed so passionate about his puppets. Naruto poked his head out from around the bathroom door, toothbrush in his mouth, and only took a single glance at the puppet in question before giving it a dismissive wave. Hey, Ashi was a good concept, at first. I liked the idea of a puppet that could fly, but would also be used for more than just recon. However, it was too difficult to put into practice. I couldn't get the wings right to sustain flight without it becoming unwholesomely inefficient. He had a few puppets that were the same. What seemed to be good ideas at first, only to find out they were useless practically. Sakura looked at the broken, unfinished puppet with a frown. It just seemed so out of place. Why keep her? She caught herself quickly. She wouldn't call these things like people. It made her sound crazy. Why keep it around then? Naruto just shrugged as he slipped back into the bathroom. The failures are just as good as the successes. They at least show me what not to do. He emerged, looking his usual overly clothed and pale self, although he now had bandages winding up his arm to hide the effects of the poison he was testing. And who knows, I might get an idea later to make her work. Shall we go then? Sakura nodded immediately, already feeling like she had spent too long inside Naruto's apartment. There was only so much crazy she could take in one day, and Naruto alone was beginning to fill her quota. As Team 7 walked into the academy for the first day of the Chunin exams, Naruto stuck towards the back of the trio. If one didn't know them very well, They might have thought he was on his own, just trailing behind a young couple. His hood was up as per usual, but for a change his orange-tinted goggles weren't hanging around his neck, but actually up on his eyes. This, combined with the slight decline of his head and the way his hood shadowed his eyes, hid where he was looking so he was safe to scout about. He did this because the Suna team was not the only foreign group he had seen skulking around Konoha in the past few days, and he wanted to learn as much about the competition as he could. So as he saw his teammates turn off on the second floor to head toward the room marked 301, he almost wanted to sigh in disappointment. Honestly, he at least expected Sasuke to spot the Jinjutsu, if nothing else, but because he should have been familiar with the academy building and where room 301 was. He was quickly proven wrong though, as Sasuke practically blurted out the presence of the Jinjutsu, Sakura naturally going along with him as the blonde watched on from the end of the hall. A bit of arrogant confidence Naruto could accept. It wasn't exactly out of character for the Uchiha. However, he drew the line when a young spandexed youth offered to spar with Sasuke, right before an exam they knew nothing about. Ahem. Sakura nearly jumped as Naruto, who she had nearly forgotten about thanks to him trailing behind a good few feet as they walked to the academy, appeared behind them. The youth, who had identified himself as Rock Lee, took in the newcomer with his large and oddly round eye, and gave a bright, twinkling smile. "Ah, you must be Uchiha Sasuke's other teammate. It is very nice to meet you." Normally that would have come across as a fairly normal greeting. However, with Lee's extremely exuberant attitude, flamboyant green clothing, and shining bowl cut, let's just say Naruto took a subtle step back. "I was just asking your most hip teammate if he would like to pit his title as prodigy against me, a genius of hard work." Naruto blinked once. Although the gesture was lost with all the ways he was hiding his eyes, as Lee offered his hand, he seemed rather insistent. "Uzumaki Naruto," he offered somewhat blandly, as he tried to dampen the over-enthusiastic handshake before the bushy-eyed boy could dislocate his shoulder. "But if you'll excuse us, we have to go to the correct room now." Lee's smile seemed to waver a moment as his gaze flickered to Sasuke. "But we were to pit out flames of youth against one another." Naruto quickly broke the handshake, placing his hands in his pockets as he gazed lazily at the boy. "We do not know what awaits us in the Chunin exams. Needless injury in a spar would only hinder us. I'm sure if you are indeed a genius of hard work." Naruto felt strange just saying the phrase. Then there will be ample opportunity within the exams themselves to fight Sasuke. For a moment, Lee seemed indecisive before his bright grin returned. With an enthusiastic nod, he gave the trio an energetic thumbs up. "You are right, Naruto-san. Truly your flames of youth burn." Anything else the garishly dressed team could say was cut off by a rather vicious chop to the back of the head by a girl of similar age. Her brown hair was styled into two buns, almost resembling panda ears. "Shut it, Lee. You're going to make us late at this rate," the girl warned in a shrill, irritated voice before turning to Team 7 with an apologetic smile and a quick bow. "Sorry about Lee, you know his type." She poked herself in the temple and gave them an almost conspiratorial look. "He's a bit touched in the head." She motioned behind her congenially to the boy who, like Naruto, had been skulking at the back of their group. The eyes and the stiff posture, not to mention the long, traditionally styled hair, gave him away as a Hyuga. "I'm Tintin and he's Niji. I guess we'll see you guys in the Chunin exams. Good luck, I suppose." The last part wasn't said with much energy, and Niji didn't seem to share the sentiment as he looked at the trio haughtily. Naruto knew the type. He had received many a similar look from the villagers when he was young. If he didn't let that get to him, ignoring this particular Hyuga's look of disdain was child's play. For a second his pale eyes seemed rather intently focused on both Sasuke and Naruto, before glancing away. At that, the two teams parted ways, Tintin practically dragging Lee one way while Team 7 headed for the other set of stairs. "Why did you stop us fighting?" Sasuke muttered as he walked to catch up with Naruto, who was uncharacteristically leading them through the academy, mostly to stop them having impromptu conversations again. "I already said, we don't know what's waiting for us in room 301. Tiring yourself out wouldn't have helped in any situation." Seeing that Sasuke didn't look particularly satisfied, Naruto just sighed and turned his head to him. "Why? Did you think tall, green, and bushy was going to offer much of a challenge?" It was a bit unfair, as Naruto had no idea of the genin's abilities, but, as Sakura snickered at the nickname, Sasuke seemed mollified. It caused the blonde to quickly shake his head. Sasuke was just too predictable sometimes. Reassure him of his own inflated self-image, and he was content to ignore anything he saw as beneath him. "Ah, well done. You all made it," Kakashi drawled from behind them as they crested the stairs, surprising all three genin and causing Sakura to nearly jump in shock. "Ah, Kakashi-sensei, don't do that," she shrieked as she held a hand to her chest, irritation clearly spreading across her reddened features. Did you say something, Sakura?" Kakashi muttered as he raised an eye from his book, clearly trying to be irritating for the sake of it, as he immediately lowered it to look at them. But in any case, it was a good thing all three of you came. If even one of you hadn't, none would have been allowed to participate. That was an interesting nugget of information, and briefly Naruto wondered if all villages did their Chunin exams like that. He suspected not. Konoha always did seem extra focused on the whole teamwork thing. "Well, I came to wish my cute little students all good luck. So, Gianni." He gave a cheeky wave and his signature smile before vanishing into a small whirlwind of leaves, leaving three flustered genin behind. They got over it quickly enough and made their way into the examination room. Thankfully, because they hadn't wasted time with Rock Lee, they were relatively early, so their entrance wasn't really noted. There were a few other teams milling about, mostly sticking in groups composed of their own villages. Naruto took the opportunity to break away from his teammates while they were distracted by all the new faces and seamlessly slipped into a nearby group of AIM genin over by a wall. It was times like these his nondescript attire and lack of visible headband came in useful. Soon, he was able to observe people slowly filter into the room. The tense atmosphere became thicker and thicker with each new entrant. It was amusing to watch his teammates flounder a moment when they realized he had vanished, but it was quickly overridden with irritation as the rest of their generation promptly arrived. "Sasuke-kun." Ino's shrill squeak sounded out through the entire room, cutting any chat that there might have been as they all set their sights on the fresh meat. Kurenai's squad quickly joined Asuma's in drawing large amounts of attention to themselves. Naruto was content to keep his head low as he slipped through the crowd, not having to be nearby to hear what they were talking about. He could have fooled himself and said he was information gathering, but with nobody talking anymore except the rookies, that would have come across fairly weak. In reality, he was searching for anybody with an aura similar to that red-haired boy he had seen on the street before. Something told him to be wary around those types until he knew exactly what he was dealing with. Eventually, some gray-haired kid a few years their senior came over to tell the rookies just what kind of a ruckus they were making. The others of his year group seemed to get the idea when they turned to the rest of the room and found practically everybody glaring at them. Even Naruto couldn't resist joining in from the back. As they quietened down and the general din of the room picked back up, he slipped back through the throngs of people until he was right next to the little group. Apparently, the newcomer, Kabuto if he heard right, was offering them information on the other participants. That was an opportunity Naruto couldn't pass up. "So, who would you like information on?" Kabuto quietly asked as he slid his spectacles further up his nose. Sasuke looked ready to step in and ask, but Naruto beat him to it as he silently slipped out of the crowd and appeared by the dark-haired boy's side. Everyone. More than a few of the rookies jumped at his sudden appearance while Shikamaru just seemed mollified to finally spot him, having previously been looking for the elusive blonde enigma. Kabuto, on the other hand, merely started, blinking rapidly as he looked down at the deck of info cards in confusion. "Sorry, did you say everyone?" Naruto nodded curtly, a small smile flickering over his features as he looked up and pulled down his goggles. "You said you had information on most of the exam participants. Surely you would be willing to share it with your kohai? The more Konoha genin pass, the better for the village's image, right?" Kabuto seemed to just gulp, not having expected this, and nervously passed the cards between his hands. "Well, you see." Suddenly, though it didn't seem to be an issue, as he turned his hands over only to realize they were empty. Naruto was already flicking through the deck, looking at each card curiously and turning them over. "Hey, wait. I need." In a strange stroke of luck for the blonde, though, Kabuto was suddenly forced to jump back as the Odo Shinobi he had previously insulted, albeit unintentionally, decided to attack. Naruto looked up to see Kabuto bend back from a rather clumsy strike from a hunched-over boy wearing bandages around his face. He blinked at the seemingly ineffective attack, as well as the odd contraption on the boy's arm Naruto's eyes were already trying to pick apart. A moment later, and his curiosity was only piqued as Kabuto's cocky smile quickly turned into one of shock as his glasses cracked and he crumpled to the floor, vomiting violently. As the sound Jinin made some taunting remark, the front of the room exploded into a cloud of dark smoke that quickly dissipated to reveal a set of stern-looking shinobi. "There will be no fighting in my exam hall," spoke the tall, bald man at the center of the new group in a gruff, no-nonsense voice. His long dark trench coat only added to his intimidating aura. "Any found doing so will be immediately disqualified." Suitably cowed, the sound trio melted back into the crowd, allowing Kabuto to try and pick himself back up. "Now, welcome to the Chunin exams, maggots. I am your worst nightmare. Your first proctor, Marino Ibiki." The entire room shuddered as the man smiled, a vicious gleam in his eyes. In short order, the Chunin proctors that had arrived with Ibiki ushered the assembled Genin to their seats. Obviously, they had gone to some trouble to make sure that all of the teams were as equally distributed from one another as possible. Naruto barely noticed, though, as he had figured out the trick to the info cards and was currently flicking through them leisurely. Of great interest to him was the Otonin that had attacked Kabuto. However, when he located that particular card, he found it frustratingly lacking, no doubt due to the small and recent nature of their village. He kept an ear out for the rules of the exam, having already worked out it would involve some kind of written challenge from the arrangement of the room. They sounded rather standard, so as he received the test, he felt ready to begin for all of 4 seconds. One look at the questions revealed they were incredibly advanced, only increasing in difficulty as they went on. Oddly enough, when he thought back on the rule about the total points of the team allowing them to pass, he realized how ridiculously simple the exam was. Luckily for him, the first question was a relatively simply cryptographed sequence, mostly logic involved, so he cracked it in short order before proceeding to turn over the exam and lean back in his chair. He got a few odd looks from the exam proctors at finishing so quickly, but he didn't get the big deal. Ibiki had clearly said that they would pass if none of their team received 0 points. So as long as Sakura and Sasuke at least got one answer, which he was sure they were capable of, they had passed. He almost wanted to chuckle as he spotted a few Genin almost tearing their hair out from the stress of the exam. For a while he returned to flipping through the deck of info cards, trying to match names to faces as he glanced about at the Genin he could see. As teams were eliminated by the proctors for cheating, which was slowly beginning to rework his opinion of the test, he discarded their cards. As it became increasingly obvious that cheating was somehow supposed to be used to pass this test, Naruto just scoffed to himself. Sure, he could probably figure out some way of gathering the correct answers, but why risk a sure pass for a chance at being caught? Fools. At one point, he finally managed to leave his little world and noticed the fact that Hinata was sitting next to him. She had at some point sidled a little closer to him on the bench during the exam, and her exam paper was clearly angled towards him. He blinked, wondering why she would so blatantly cheat and risk her entire team's disqualification. He ignored it as best he could, though, even when she kept nervously glancing across at him like she wanted to speak. Another foolish idea in the middle of a heavily observed test. Eventually, though, the time passed, and the last 15 minutes were upon them. Ibiki cleared his voice at the front to gain their attention. By this point, the room had thinned to contain less than half its original occupants, drastically reducing the number of cards in Naruto's deck. It certainly made finding specific information easier, which he continued to do as Ibiki explained the rules of the last question. It was foolish, really, the number of people that were unnerved by the simple ultimatum, especially the ones who did not belong to Konoha. Ibiki had no kind of control whether or not they could retake the exams if they weren't held in his village. Even for the Leaf Nin, it was silly. The man had clearly offered them the choice between having the chance to continue on or just give up. Only people who had no confidence in their skills would choose the latter, and even if Naruto did fail the question and, by some miracle, was barred from future Chunin exams, there were other ways to be promoted. There would always be other chances to find the reception and opportunities to show off his skill. If there weren't, he would make them. It seemed the last 45 minutes of cheating their way through the exam hadn't done much for the other participants' nerves. Hands began rising, left, right, and center, as people lost their confidence and opted out, taking their teammates with them. It obviously wasn't happening at a rate Ibiki approved of, as he decided to speed things up a little by shaking their confidence further. Naturally, he chose the person he saw as least affected by his speech, likely because it appeared Naruto was ignoring him, content to flick through his cards. In fact, as the bandana-clad man pointed in his direction, a challenging smirk on his features, he didn't even look up. "What about you there, sunshine in the hood? Are you really stubborn enough to risk both your and your teammates' careers? You'll have no chance to advance ever again. Always stuck with D ranks and C ranks until the day you retire." There was an unnerving silence as Naruto seemed to ignore the man, still flicking through the cards absently. After a period of about 20 seconds, though, where you could have heard a pin drop, Naruto flicked out a single card and looked at it with interest. "Marino Ibiki, what do you know? These cards have information on the proctors as well." The dark-clothed man at the front of the room narrowed his eyes slightly, tilting his head slightly to try and get a better look at the card in question. Head of the Torture and Interrogation Department, specializing in psychological torture. Ibiki's eyes widened slightly, worried the genin was about to give the game away, when he surprised the man by groaning and leaning back, looking genuinely morose as he slapped the cards down. "Damn, I guess with that kind of no-nonsense, toughening career, you would be the type to hate reckless choices grounded on nothing but stubborn pride. Plus, as a Konoha shinobi, I bet you must hate the idea of needlessly endangering comrades, right?" He sighed again, a long, drawn-out noise that only served to enhance the tense atmosphere in the room. Ibiki was watching him intently at this point, confused to where he was going with this, but keeping his features schooled. "Damn." Naruto leaned forward, looking as though he was about to stand up. "I guess I oughta. I quit." Suddenly, just as it looked like Naruto was about to forfeit, a young AIM genin at the back of the room stood up, his hand raised as he nervously declared his intentions. "I quit too, screw the risk." Another genin, this one from Konoha, also stood up, and soon it seemed like the entire room was clamoring to give up in the exams. None of them noticed as Naruto smirked victoriously, subtly sitting back down as they were all ushered out of the room along with their teams. By the end of it all, the exam room had been practically decimated, only 17 teams remaining. Ironically, the only person to notice Naruto sitting back down was Hinata, someone who by all rights looked as though they were about to quit anyway. Naruto simply leaned back in his seat, a small smirk playing across his features that only Ibiki noticed. The scarred jounin could only internally gape at what he assumed was a green genin. He was quickly re-evaluating his opinion. The boy had used the opportunity he had presented him to completely psyche out the competition. Hell, if they weren't in the middle of the Chunin exams, Ibiki might have requested the boy be sent over to TNI for a bit of formal training in psychological warfare. When it finally seemed like everybody who was still there was there to stay, Ibiki cleared his throat, quickly launching into a small speech about the significance of their choice. There were a few outraged cries from the remaining participants about the supposed pointlessness of it all, blissfully ignoring the lack of significant opposition now. In a way, Naruto was almost inclined to agree. After all, he could have bluffed his way through that initial test by simply walking in, sitting down, and then not moving for the remainder of the test. It was a flimsy loophole at best, and he assumed most genin didn't have his lack of care for promotion. Just as Ibiki was reaching the end of his tirade, having already revealed the hideous scarring on his head, an energetic purple ball smashed through the window. It quickly unraveled into a large banner held in place by precisely thrown kunai, leaving many in the room to gape at the scantily clad woman who had emerged from the bundle, excitedly pointing at all the Chunin hopefuls. "This is no time to be celebrating." The woman gave the entire room a chilling smile, although most of the men in the room weren't exactly focused on her face. "I am Mitarashi Anko, your second proctor." She pumped her fist up into the air, making her trench coat wave in the breeze to reveal scintillating flesh only barely hidden by a tightly woven mesh shirt. "Now follow me." Once again, you could have heard a pin drop. The silence was so all-encompassing. Naruto actually swore he heard a cicada chirp somewhere outside the window the woman had crashed through. Bad timing, Anko. As the woman sunk a little, an embarrassed blush encroaching across her cheeks, Naruto took a moment to examine her closer as she turned to bicker with Ibiki, taking in her vibrant purple hair and almost pupilless brown eyes. With a start, he realized that she was the woman who had originally given him the inspiration for Ramia. He was briefly excited, flicking through the cards he had left to see if she was included. She wasn't, unfortunately. It seemed she was a relatively new proctor. As she turned back to the room, something else caught his eye. It was hidden behind the high collar of her coat, but he definitely caught sight of a small black seal on her neck. Even with his limited experience with Fuinjutsu and the simplistic appearance of the seal, he could tell that it was a complicated piece of work. Instantly, his interest was piqued by a previously unknown part of him waking up and taking notice. Unfortunately, any further examination was sidelined as Anko seemed to get over her own faux pas and turned back to the examinees. "I'll explain everything when we've exchanged places, so follow me." The woman naturally dived straight back out the window she had smashed, leaving a room of 51 confused genin and an exasperated Ibiki. Eventually, the group snapped out of their stupor and made after the woman, not trusting her unpredictability to possibly disqualify them if they were too late. Naruto trailed along after his teammates as they dashed after the rest of the group, but his thoughts were elsewhere, focused on the new feelings circulating his mind after seeing that seal. Naruto had, of course, dabbled in the sealing arts. His puppets would have been woefully less effective without seals to regulate their movements. He had no idea how Suna puppeteers caused their creations to move, but Naruto's moved through seals that he affected with specific pulses of chakra he sent through his threads. They were simplistic at best, though, carrying simple, pre-prepared instructions to the aspect of the puppet they controlled. However, it was the way they all linked together in one great array throughout the puppet that Naruto was proud of. However, while he was not unfamiliar with the art, he couldn't say that he had been particularly involved in it before now. True, it came rather easily to him, as normally he just needed to think about what he wanted to do and the seals would simply arrange themselves in his mind. It was that same ease that also left him disinterested in the practice. Naruto was so used to challenges and obstacles in his life that having something simply come to him, without work, seemed almost alien. The lack of challenge left him feeling without accomplishment, so he only used Fuinjutsu for what he needed and never just experimented with it like he might poisons, or mechanisms, or designs. Seeing that little, innocuous, inverted Mitsudomo design seemed to spark some flame of completion within him that had previously remained unlit. He felt the sudden urge to compare his own work with somebody else's, an innate desire to be proven superior. As he jogged, Naruto quickly shook his head of that. He was almost starting to sound like Sasuke. That tantalizing sensation of competitive spirit didn't leave him, though. So by the time they caught up to everybody outside the familiar chain-link fence of Training Ground 44, he felt a little restless. "All right, my little Chunin hopefuls," Anko called out from the front of the crowd, an all-too-innocent grin on her features. "You guys are about to find out why this place is called the Forest of Death." Naruto spotted that at his chance to rile up the woman. Naturally, if he wanted to examine that mark some more, he needed to interact with her. Interest equaled interaction. He knew that the quickest way to get someone interested in you was to aggravate or irritate them. People always have the innate desire to see their own opinions win out, so clashing opposing ideals against them created the first strenuous ties of a connection. Wow, big trees and animals, so terrifying. Naruto managed in a perfect deadpan, his expression the epitome of boredom as he stared up at the massive trees that inhabited the large training ground. It helped that he had been in there before to examine the unique wildlife and collect plant samples for poisons. He was expecting the retaliation, as he assumed Anko was the type who didn't like people messing with her mysterious and dread-inducing atmosphere, so he didn't even try to dodge when she threw a kunai to slice his cheek. Tough guys like you are usually the first to get eaten." The woman appeared behind him in what was, admittedly, an impressive show of speed. She leaned over his shoulder to lick up a long line of his blood with the creepiest look of satisfaction she could manage. Around them, Naruto's team very much included, the genin cringed away from the strange and disgusting act. Although one Kusa Genin with long black hair on the other side of the crowd was watching with a strange glint in her eye. Naruto, on the other hand, smiled lightly, craning his neck to look at the woman. She was intentionally pushing her assets against his back to cause him further discomfort. Thanks for the advice. I'll have to make sure anybody who eats me regrets it soon after. Obviously, Anko didn't recognize him, no doubt because of the hood and goggles hiding most of his features. Although the whisker marks on his cheeks should have been a bit of a giveaway. Perhaps she just had a bad memory? In either case, Naruto quickly flipped a small vial of yellow liquid from one of his pouches and offered it to the woman with a small smirk. You'll be needing this in a few minutes. It was a strange day when Naruto had discovered that his own blood was mildly poisonous. Not lethally so, of course, but enough to cause discomfort to people who weren't him. It was no doubt the cocktails of different chemicals he kept injecting himself with over the years. What are you? Anko blinked, her vision distorting slightly as a sudden itch caused her to absently scratch at her arm, only for it to persist. Her skin paled, and the veins around the edges of her eyes became just a little more prominent. He smirked again as he pressed the tiny vial into her hand and turned back to his team. Didn't someone ever tell you not to lick strange people's blood? Naruto asked quietly, so the other genin couldn't overhear them. It would be better if they had to imagine what the crazy proctor was talking about with the quiet, unperturbed genin. People's imaginations tended to provide a much better image than anything Naruto could have spun for himself. Deciding to just leave the genin be for now and focus on why she suddenly felt like she had just woken up with a killer hangover, Anko turned away from Naruto and addressed the rest of the genin while attempting to keep her face straight. She began explaining the rules of the second exam, all the while trying not to itch her arm where, if you could see under her trench coat, as many of the males in the crowd surely wished they could, the veins along her arm were becoming more visible. Naruto kept an ear open but turned back to his team with a small smirk hidden in the shadows of his hood. He was sure Anko would be interested in him now. As he turned back to his team, he was only met by an angry-looking Sakura and a fist to the gut. What the hell was that, Naruto baka? Now you've drawn everybody's attention to us. Her voice was a furious whisper, trying not to exacerbate the damage Naruto had done. Naruto took the blow. It wasn't that strong anyway, but as soon as she released him, he looked up, fixing her with a rather chilling smirk. You shouldn't worry so much, Sakura. His goggles flashed in the light for a moment as he gazed at her more intently, his expression becoming a blank slate. But hit me again, and I'll turn you into a puppet. The Pinkette gulped as she nervously took a step back, freaked out by how quickly Naruto's normal expression returned to his face from the momentary lapse. She increasingly got the impression that her quiet teammate wasn't the most stable person. She was saved as Sasuke grunted, butting in on the conversation with a cocky smirk. Weren't you the one who said we shouldn't take unnecessary risks without knowing what the next challenge is? He interjected, parroting Naruto's words from earlier back to him in an attempt to expose his hypocrisy. The blonde just turned his attention away from Sakura and snorted softly. Unknown. We knew from the moment the proctor said she would be cutting the group in half that we would be pitted against one another somehow, Naruto explained dismissively. It would have to be in teams as we passed or failed the first exams as a team. The fact that it takes place here only shows there will be a survival element, meaning the test will get more difficult the more time passes. All I did was make it so we will be targeted, bringing the other competitors to us early so we have a higher chance of confronting them with more energy. In the background, Anko validated his quick summary as she produced 2 types of scrolls and explained the test. HN. Apparently Sasuke wasn't too happy with that as he clicked his tongue and turned away, plunging the team into an awkward silence that persisted as they signed the indemnity forms, collected their heaven scroll, and took their place at their assigned gate. Sakura looked as though she wanted to say something so the team wouldn't start off the exam so disjointed. Anything she might have tried was drowned out as the speaker system around the training grounds perimeter blared to life. The second stage of the Chunin exam start now, Anko's voice shouted, garbled by the slight crackle of the speaker. A final piece of advice. The locks to the 17 gates about the forest clicked with the sound of a buzzer. Don't die. Team 7 didn't enter training ground 44 under the best of relations. Sasuke was annoyed at Naruto for, in his own mind, one-upping him, while the blonde in turn was irritated at Sasuke for second-guessing him. Sakura, on the other hand, was helpless against watching her teammates silently brood. One she was frightened of, even if she wouldn't say it, and the other she admired, and couldn't bring herself to doubt. It put them in a stalemate situation for almost 2 minutes as they hopped through the trees in the direction of the tower, none of them speaking. Surprisingly, it was Sasuke who finally pulled them to a stop in a relatively enclosed clearing, turning back to the others with grim-faced irritation as he overcame his own stubbornness. "We need a plan. We can't just run in here without any idea what we're doing." Dropping down from the trees to join him, Naruto and Sakura briefly shared a glance before nodding, although somewhat reluctantly in the case of the former. "I agree with you for once." Sasuke's eye twitched, but he didn't say anything against the baiting comment. "Good, then you can hold the scroll." He flipped it out of his pouch and tossed it over the blonde, who examined it momentarily before slipping it out of sight in his jacket. "I'm not complaining, but why me?" he questioned lazily, not really caring one way or another, but interested in the Uchiha's thought process. "I would have thought Sakura would make a better choice." Catching Sakura's confused expression, he smirked at her and quickly clarified. "Nobody would think you'd have it, after all." The pinkette blinked owlishly before scowling as she realized the underlying insult. Again, Sasuke ignored Naruto's attempts at riling his teammates up. He wasn't even sure why the blonde was doing so. "Because you have so many pockets that even you lose track of the things you carry, it will force any teams trying to get our scroll to waste time." To his explanation, Naruto just shrugged, seemingly accepting it without qualm. "So next we need to decide how we tackle this challenge. I think we should head to the tower and set up an ambush for other teams, take their scrolls quickly, and deal with less risk, because we're already close to the endpoint." He looked about, spotting Sakura get over her irritation to nod acceptingly and Naruto tilt his head slightly. "Sounds like a solid plan," the blonde intoned blandly, making Sasuke nod. The Uchiha made to say more, only to be cut off as Naruto continued. "Unless..." Sasuke's eye twitched more prominently this time as he caught the blonde's smirk, even hidden under his hood's shadows as it was. "Unless what?" Naruto made to speak before seemingly thinking better of it, waving his hand dismissively. Sasuke eyes him for a moment, but the blonde's face was deceptively blank. Yet again, though, as he made to continue, the puppeteer cut in. "Unless you consider the fact that other teams will think of the same idea. We're among the youngest in these exams, so that gives the other participants an edge in height and leg length. If they decide to set up ambushes, then they'll get there first, and there's nothing we can do about it. If we try to do the same, it will only draw us into their traps." He shrugged neutrally before raising his hands up in mock placation. "But, of course, as team leader you have final say, right? I'm just going to get some water." He flipped a small canteen out of one of his many pockets and moved over to the stream that cut through the small clearing. "Fine, then what do you?" Sasuke trailed off as he watched the blonde collect water, thinking back to the map the proctor had briefly shown them. "Okay then, we'll head for the stream that runs through the training ground. Other teams will need to go for water, and it will be an easy place to set up a loose ambush. Plus, we'll have a more or less straight shot for the tower after we get another scroll." Naruto walked back with a now full canteen, and Sasuke just stared at him, daring the blonde to challenge him this time. The puppeteer remained silent, only giving a curt nod as he hid a small smirk with a sip of water. They spent another few minutes just ironing out details such as code words if they got separated, how they would deal with the night if they couldn't get a scroll by the end of the day, and other such things. By the time they were done, it had been almost 10 minutes since the exam started, and they were all eager to get moving again. When they began to move through the trees again, using the sun to navigate their way towards the stream, Naruto noticed the wind change rather abruptly. Before he could even warn his teammates of the anomaly, the sudden breeze became a torrential gale. It actually picked him up off his feet despite the fact he was sticking to the trees with chakra. A few rather painful impacts with sturdy branches later, and Naruto was picking himself up in an unfamiliar clearing, teammates nowhere in sight. By the time he determined where he had come from, though, by the trail of wooden debris, it was too late, as a voice broke the tentative silence. "Just like Orochimaru-sama predicted, right, Dosu? The blonde whirled, His eyes narrowed as he easily picked out the three shadowy forms that emerged from the surrounding trees. They were the team from Otogakure. Their headbands gave away that much, and they didn't look all that surprised to see him here alone. It was that last part that caught his interest as he carefully maneuvered a hand into one of his jacket's outer pockets. Orochimaru, the hunchbacked one who had been addressed as Dosu by the other boy with spiky brown hair, simply growled as he swatted his teammate on the back of the head. This is why I say you talk too much, Zaku. Naruto would have used the opportunity to act, but their third team member, a girl with long black hair reaching almost down to her feet, was watching him like a hawk. Like it matters much, the kid's gonna be dead in a few minutes anyway. Naruto's eyes narrowed at Zaku's tone, mostly the sadistic glee with which he said it. That, combined with the fact the boy had death written all over his shirt, quite literally, didn't paint a good picture of his personality. Would you two shut up already and get on with it? This wasn't the only task he set us, you know? It was the girl who spoke, finally diverting her attention from him enough that Naruto was able to whip out a concealed scroll, spread it out in front of him, and slam his palm into the ceiling matrix all in a single second. Suddenly, it wasn't 3-on-1 as Ramia appeared, coiled around his body protectively as Naruto kept his cold eyes on all of them. The clearing became incredibly tense at that point as the three realized they had wasted too much time and allowed Naruto to prepare. What other tasks? Naruto asked almost conversationally as he brought his goggles up to his eyes in a slow, deliberate movement. The three Odo shinobi sneered at him, but surprisingly, it was the seemingly reserved girl that answered. Orochimaru-sama asked us to deal with you while he entertained your friends. She spat with enough venom that told Naruto that she hadn't had a pleasant past with Konoha shinobi. That's all you need to know, little leaf hugger. For whatever reason, Orochimaru, of the Densetsu no Sannin no less, wanted him and his teammates separated. That couldn't be good for either of them. You're right, that is all I need to know. One of the scales on Ramia's tail suddenly opened, dropping a smoke bomb that immediately enshrouded the clearing with a thick white smoke. Before it even cleared, Zaku could be heard yelping as Ramia's tail suddenly appeared out of nowhere, aimed directly at his head. He ducked and dived back as the puppet came full circle and lashed out with its claws. The slight purple sheen they had showed even a single scratch wouldn't end well. By then the smoke had cleared and Naruto was nowhere to be seen. Instinctively, thanks to advice offered by their master, all three Odo genin looked to the puppet in an attempt to trace back the chakra threads that must be attached, only to find none. From the trees, Naruto found this reaction highly interesting as nobody outside of Konoha and Name should have known about him being a puppeteer. Their actions and lack of surprise implied prior knowledge. His attention was diverted as Zaku suddenly raised his hands at Ramia, and, knowing that no shinobi ever just raised their hands in a fight for no reason, Naruto forced his puppet to curve its body out the way. Zenkaha. It proved the right choice as a few splinters of wood were suddenly shaved from Ramia's side by a seemingly invisible blast. Whatever it was, it ripped a dangerously large hole in a tree on the other side of the clearing. Naruto blinked in surprise as he spotted the tubes in Zaku's palms as the Odonin launched successive blasts of the technique. Ramia writhed out the way each time thanks to her flexible body and Naruto's overview of the clearing. The other two were holding back though, whether it was because they believed their partner could handle it or because they didn't think their techniques would be effective on a puppet he didn't know. Why don't you actually show yourself, little leaf hugger, instead of hiding behind your dolls? Zaku called out, a grin on his face as he continued to blast away at the slithering puppet in his attempts to reduce it to sawdust. But you look like you're having fun. Naruto's disembodied voice called out from the trees. It was immediately met by a salvo of sunbon that thudded uselessly into an empty tree. From his real hiding spot, Naruto raised an eyebrow. Glad he had thrown his voice. Why was it always sunbon users? That was a good throw. Nearly nicked me there. Deciding to mess with them this time, Naruto threw his voice to the opposite side of the clearing. Yet again, sunbon dropped from the girl's sleeves and into her hands before she let them all fly with deadly, if not misplaced, accuracy. Stop underestimating us, the girl called out, anger clearly clouding her judgment as she began throwing sunbon in seemingly any random direction. Kin, don't get so angry, their apparent leader, Dosu, called out. He still hadn't made any big moves during the course of the fight. Naruto just watched in slight amusement as the thin metal tools thudded uselessly into trees all around the clearing. At least, until a few embedded themselves in the trunk next to him, causing him to blink at the near miss. Is that a bell? The blonde thought, not a moment before Kin suddenly pulled on the near-invisible threads of ninja wire tied to her fingers, causing the bells around the clearing to tinkle softly. A wave of nausea washed over Naruto, and that light tinkling turning into a clanging gong in his head, it immediately causing him to overbalance, tipping right off the branch he was on and falling to the ground in a pained heap. Damn, I hate Jinjutsu, he groaned as he flung himself to the side just as the spot he was just occupying was smashed into dust and bits of plant matter. Moving proved rather difficult. He attempted to get to his feet only to find himself unstable and the world moving in confusing ways. What he did spot was Zaku's hands, strange metal tubes included, pointing in his direction. Shakily, his fingers twitched, and Ramia was suddenly interposed between them, ready to absorb the blow. Surprise. His eyes widened at the sudden, gruff voice to the side, and he was only just fast enough to bend his head out the way of a vicious right hook, only to realize his mistake moments later as the familiar metal gauntlet passed a few inches from his face. Immediately, a rush of nausea far worse than Kin's attack tore through him, sending the world spinning and his insides twisting as he fought down his stomach's contents. Unfortunately, this also meant he lost control of his fingers, causing Ramia to slump over. Zaku immediately took the opportunity to blast the defenseless puppet with his invisible wind blasts. Naruto had built Ramia strong, and she was able to absorb a few of the hits, the natural design of her body allowing the force to be distributed evenly and allowing her to bend with the blasts, reducing their impact. However, without Naruto to control it, there was only so much the puppet could take before Zaku scowled, setting his feet and squaring his shoulders. Zenkikyakuwa, a much more powerful blast of wind ripped from his hands, tearing across the clearing and smashing right into the hapless wooden construct. Zenkikyakuwa, a much more powerful blast of wind ripped from his hands, tearing across the clearing and smashing right into the hapless wooden construct. Instantly, everything below the snake-like puppet's head and most of its tail were shredded apart into nothing but chunks of wood and splinters. In the only good turn of events that brought, though, the countless sunbon hidden away in Ramia's body were instantly scattered by the massive blast, forcing all three of the Odonin to take cover from them. Naruto took the unprecedented opportunity to scrabble away from Dosu, holding back his vomit and blinking rapidly to try and dissuade the dizziness that had come over him. By the time any of his attackers realized he had gone, he was already up in the trees, scrabbling through his pouches to find something to deal with the nausea he was feeling. He had developed poisons to simulate the effect, so he could only hope the corresponding antidote would do something. Thankfully, only a few moments after he had injected himself directly in the neck, he felt his vision correct itself and his balance issues fade away. It didn't do much for how sick he felt, but that wasn't too debilitating. Come out, little leaf hugger. We destroyed your puppet, so you might as well come quietly. Naruto chuckled softly, still instinctually throwing his voice to make it sound distant from himself. Foolish. All three Odonin's ears pricked up, trying to locate the boy now that they were savvy to his little ventriloquist act. Naruto, on the other hand, simply reached into his pocket, withdrawing another scroll that he quickly opened and unsealed. To assume I only have the one. The three could only ponder on his words before they heard an unsettling skittering sound. It was Kin who spotted it first, it most definitely being the best way to describe the monstrosity that emerged from the trees. Long, lank white hair sticking together lay like a messy veil over dark, glassy eyes that stared at them, almost as if the thing was alive. That was all Kin ever got to see before it raised one of its long, spindly legs and shot a single sunbon, faster than any human could ever throw, from the tip. It landed with deadly accuracy, embedding in the Odo Kunoichi's neck and causing her to almost instantly slump to the ground like a sack of potatoes. Zaku and Dosu were more on guard for the next barrage. the former sending them careening off course with his wind blasts, and the latter batting them away with his gauntlet. The new arrival quickly scuttled back into the darkness of the trees, leaving the two alone again. "Do you like her?" Naruto's voice called out, taunting them further as they continued to hear that unsettling skitter all around them. "I call her Erikun." Dosu's eyes nervously glanced around into the trees, never once noticing the shadow that is slowly descending over his own. "Say hello, Erikun." Dosu wasn't ashamed to say. He screamed as he looked up, right into the emotionless wooden face of the puppet. Under the right circumstances, he might have said that face was beautifully sculpted. However, the four smaller glassy eyes above the main pair and the disgustingly segmented jaw shattered any illusions of beauty. What the fuck is this thing? Dosu tripped over his own feet as he backpedaled away from the puppet, which he now saw to be hanging by a long silvery thread emerging from its bulbous black abdomen. It opened its mouth, much wider than should have been possible for any human, and hissed at him, what looked to be thick, viscous saliva dripping from its mouth. Suddenly it spat at him, a great glob of that same substance, and Dosu automatically raised his gauntlet to protect him. He could only watch in fear as whatever the substance was ate right through the metal like it was damp paper. In his shock, he didn't even make a move as Erikun dropped to the ground, scuttling forward and picking him up in her two human arms. It was only when she opened up her impossibly wide mouth again, the cheeks and jaw literally unhinging, did he begin to struggle, closing his eyes in fear. The wad of acid to the face never came. Instead, he felt something vaguely soft and moist envelop his head before moving across his shoulders and arms. It was only by the time his entire torso was enveloped did he snap out of it, kicking and struggling in vain. He opened his eyes to see only darkness. A pungent smell invaded his nose that made his eyes heavy and his movements weaker until his vision blurred right into unconsciousness. Zaku watched on in fascination and disgust as his teammate was eaten in front of him. The plates that formed Erikun's body shifted and moved with the lump he knew to be Dosu's body, revealed to be attached to some membranous material that could expand and contract to accommodate the prisoner as they were swallowed. He guessed Dosu ended up in the dull black abdomen the woman's torso was attached to, along with 8 skittering black legs that were deceptively fast. As that same puppet turned its eyes on him, he immediately raised his arms warningly, aware he was the last one of his team left standing. "Your teammate isn't dead." The brown-haired boy started, arms raised as he spotted Naruto drop into the clearing, strategically keeping Erikun between him and Zaku. "He's just lying in a gaseous blend of various drugs that will keep him asleep as long as he's inside Erikun." Naruto smirked as Zaku's hands twitched, and Erikun in turn moved her laden-down torso into his line of fire. "Don't be too hasty. One wrong move, and you'll blast your friend into little bloody chunks." At that, Zaku sneered, motioning towards Kin's limp body without ever taking the eyes off the blonde. He really wished the puppeteer's long jacket wasn't covering his hands. He couldn't know what the boy was doing with his fingers, and it unnerved him. "It doesn't matter anyway," he shot back. "One of my teammates is dead, so it's not like we can proceed." Naruto's eyes to quickly glance at Kin, a small smile growing on his face. "She's not dead, just unconscious. Hand over your scroll and leave peacefully, and I'll give you back both your teammates. There's still 4 days for you to gain 2 scrolls. It's better than having no chance." Zaku's eyes narrowed. There was no way to know if the blonde was telling the truth, or even if he would simply stab them in the back the moment they tried to leave. It wasn't the usual style for a Leaf Nin, but Orochimaru had told them to be especially wary of this one. "Might want to decide quickly. One twitch of my fingers and Dosu there gets a test of something a little more lethal," Naruto offered in a faux-friendly voice, causing Zaku's eyes to narrow as he went for the pouch on his hip. "Fine." He removed his earth scroll, trying to see by Naruto's expression if it was the one the blonde needed, only to get stonewalled by the puppeteer's expressionless mask. He suddenly threw it up into the air towards Naruto, the blonde's eyes naturally flicking up to follow its trajectory. In that moment, Zaku grinned viciously, arms coming up as he built up an enormous amount of chakra. "I changed my mind." Naruto realized too late that he had made a mistake trying to barter the lives of the boy's teammate against his own safety. "Zenkikakuwa." A concentrated gale thundered out of the experimental tubes in Zaka's arms, slamming right through Erakun's exposed abdomen. The weakened blast caught Naruto in the side as he tried to move out the way, too slowly though. He was sent careening through the air, all sense of direction torn from him as the world spun for a brief but tumultuous moment before he slammed bodily into a tree. The tree didn't give, but it felt like his body did. He slumped to the ground, vision swimming and intermittently darkening. It all snapped into blinding clarity, though as a sudden sharp pain caused his head to snap up only to see Zaku's smirking face sneer down at him as the boy shoved his sandal into Naruto's shoulder. Not so conversational now. A little leaf hugger? Not when I'm the one in control, right? Naruto's head lilted slightly, and the blonde knew very well he was likely concussed. It didn't help that he could see and feel something warm and wet dripping over his right eye. Zaku brought his attention back to him by pressing harder on his shoulder where he realized he had a large and bloody gash, given the warm sensation dripping down his left arm. I couldn't give two shits about those deadweight teammates of mine. Our orders were never to proceed, just to deal with you. He raised his hands and grinned, giving Naruto a good view down the barrels of his surgically implanted tubes. What was that? The grinning boy asked imperiously as he heard Naruto murmur something weakly. The boy obviously wasn't all there after his impact. I said, "Do you have clans in Odogakure?" Naruto mumbled. Zaku leaned back a little, his brow furrowing as he stared at the blonde in confusion, watching as he looked up at the Odonin with his cracked goggles. "What the hell are you talking about, tree hugger? How hard did you hit your head?" Naruto chuckled weakly, unnerving the other boy. "I just wanted to know if you had clans." His voice was a little shaky, and he was stumbling over his words, but it still got the point across. "I always admired the Abure myself. I love the way they manipulate their insects, like a swarm of tiny little puppets." Zaku blinked and brought his hands up straighter, almost pressing them right into Naruto's face. "What the hell are you going on about now?" Naruto grinned slightly. It was a manic, desperate kind of expression that only served to unsettle. "Nothing much. I'm just trying to keep you busy while I direct a miniature puppet disguised as a fly onto your shoulder." As he spoke, his words gained confidence and clarity, revealing himself to be not as nearly injured as he pretended to be. Before Zaku could even manage an ineloquent he suddenly lacked a head with which to say the words. The tiny little insect-shaped puppet on his shoulder exploded with the force of the exploding seal inscribed meticulously onto its body, and the boy's head was reduced to a messy red paste, thankfully scattering away from Naruto. For what felt like a long few minutes, Naruto just sat there, still slumped against the tree and surrounded by the remains of his puppets and the Odonin. After a few disgruntled noises from somewhere in the back of his throat, he dragged himself to his feet, swaying slightly as he clutched at his shoulder. A grimace worked its way onto his lips as he stared across at the wooden wreckage around him. His puppets were pretty much unsalvageable at this point. Ramia lacked a torso, and most of her tail, and Erikun lacked her body, most of it lying in bloody splinters around the limp construct. That was when it all really slammed into the puppeteer. Right now he was completely alone. He had no puppets, no defenses against the people and dangers around him, nothing separating him from the world. For just that brief, fleeting moment, Naruto was truly terrified. This wasn't like Nami. There was no convenient period to recuperate and fix everything, no time to plan. At any moment, other genin, drawn by the sounds of their conflict, could come through those trees, spotting him there, injured and defenseless. His breathing became faster as his heart hammered in his chest, not knowing what to do now. The world seemed to slow down as his eyes caught sight of Kin's limp body. All three of the Odonin were dead. Naruto was just bluffing earlier. However, where Dosu's body was just scattered chunks of meat and Zaku was currently missing his head, Kin's body was pristine, the only damage being a slight sunburn wound to the neck. She just lay there, a full movable, operational body, just going to waste. It took around 5 minutes for Naruto to collect up the usable remains of his puppets, collecting the Odo team's Earth Scroll on his way out of the clearing. It was another 5 minutes of backtracking through the trees, though, before he found his team. He almost wished he hadn't, though. There were obvious signs of a conflict, destruction of trees and numerous scorch marks, and kunai scattered about. Just as he was wondering what happened to his teammates, he spotted Sasuke's limp form on the forest floor. He dropped down next to him, noticing the dark-haired Uchiha was twitching and writhing in place, obviously unconscious, but still in a great deal of apparent pain. A light sheen of sweat coated his body, and he had a few tears across his clothing and skin, most noticeably a stab wound in his thigh. It all seemed to stem from the angrily pulsing seal on his neck, a seal Naruto recognized all too well from seeing on Anko's neck only hours ago. A rush of exhaustion overcame Naruto's body as he thought of that. It seemed like so much longer than that now. He fought it back, examining the seal as it writhed and pulsed an ugly orange color, something Naruto never thought he would hear himself think. To be honest, Naruto couldn't make heads nor tails of it. It was far too complex, and he simply lacked the necessary knowledge. He could work out that it appeared to be slowly killing Sasuke, and he couldn't let that happen. Quickly using his fingers to sketch out various kanji in the air that lingered for a few moments as a faint, wispy mist, he gathered them up and swiftly slammed them onto the seal. It seemed to literally twitch and writhe in panic before falling still, softening into a dull black. Naruto may have lacked the skill to remove the seal, but even a novice could put a barrier around it to seal it off from the rest of Sasuke's body. With another twist of his fingers, the seal seemed to almost eat itself, vanishing into flawless skin like it was never there. Naruto figured if he hid the seal so Sasuke didn't know he had it, then perhaps he would never try to use it. There was a lot of malevolence contained within that innocuous Mitsudomo design. Sasuke also fell silent, his body falling limp as he gave into less fretful unconsciousness, allowing Naruto's attention to turn to locating his other teammate. He found her up on the branch of a tree, and once again, he wished he hadn't. She was dead. There was no kind or easy way of saying it. Her neck had been cleanly snapped, leaving her lifeless body to lie draped over the branch like some sick ornament. He carefully retrieved her, bringing her down to where Sasuke lay and setting her body on the ground. If Naruto was honest with himself, the next few minutes passed by in somewhat of a blur, his mind refusing to acknowledge what he was seeing. Instead, he focused on bandaging up his wounds, cleaning off his bloodied clothes in a nearby stream, and making sure the clearing had a few traps to deter other teams. Eventually, Naruto ran out of things to do, and Sakura wasn't getting any less dead, or so his morbid thoughts helpfully informed him. He found himself sitting next to her, his face twisted into a scowl as he stared at her almost serene features. Aside from her cold, pale skin, he could almost imagine she was sleeping. He wished that was all it was. Damn it. He suddenly turned and threw the earth scroll he had been tightly clutching across the clearing, as much good as it did them with a dead teammate. His chest heaved for a while as he simply glared at nothing, as if he were trying to burn a hole straight through one of the forest's oversized trees. He clenched his teeth and looked back at Sakura, still scowling and wondering just why he cared so much. He cared little for Sakura as a teammate, less so as a person. So why did he care if she was dead? What difference did it make? You can't progress in the exams without all three team members, a helpful little voice in the back of his mind offered, allowing Naruto to latch onto that thought. Yes, he cared because it was a hindrance. He needed her alive, otherwise they were stuck, the two scrolls completely useless. He looked back down at Sakura's cold form, agonizing over what to do, and all these irritating little feelings that kept sweeping over him weren't helping. His mind offered up images of a crying little pink-haired girl being comforted by a youthful, innocent blonde only to swat them away. Naruto didn't have time for the sentimental thoughts. He needed to stay focused. What's going on? Naruto almost wanted to groan as he heard Sasuke speak up, the dark-haired teen propping himself up on an elbow and placing a hand on his forehead. Naruto? Sasuke questioned as black eyes locked onto blue. Naruto's goggles were down because they were useless in their cracked state. Wait. The boy's eyes snapped open in alarm as he jerked about, eyes scanning this way and that for an invisible threat. Kusanine. Sakura. Orochimaru. He shouted fervently only to quiet as he saw Naruto shush him with a scowl. Things were bad enough without alerting any nearby teams of their distress. Quiet down, Naruto hissed out in a quiet but surprisingly authoritative tone. Orochimaru is gone. I found you guys like this. Sasuke took a moment to calm himself before locking eyes with Naruto heatedly. Where were you? Thankfully, he managed a hoarse whisper. I was ambushed the moment I got to my feet back there. I only managed to beat them and get here around half an hour ago. Sasuke narrowed his eyes at him, but Naruto held his ground and eventually relented, his eyes naturally falling down until they rested on Sakura's unnaturally pale form. Wait, Sakura, is she okay? Naruto was surprised by the genuine concern that seemed to come from the self-proclaimed avenger. He hadn't, though the boy cared much for Sakura. He was about to tell him the truth when his own mouth betrayed him. She's fine. At that time, Naruto had no idea why he straight out lied to the boy. Later, he would look back and realize if he hadn't, things might have gone so very differently. But she isn't breathing. Naruto grimaced at the Uchiha's observation, his mind whirling at a mile a minute. He was committed to the lie now. She was badly injured when I got here. I needed to give her a drug to relax her body. It's a side effect. You remember what that hunter Nin did to Zabuza? Sasuke looked down at Sakura's body for a second before nodding slowly, unnerved by how much it looked like she was actually dead. Don't worry about her. I know enough to treat her, but we'll need to get to the tower soon. Sasuke was still staring at Sakura, but was snapped out of it by Naruto's voice. But wait. He trailed off as he saw Naruto hold up the 2 scrolls they now had. I took it off the team that ambushed us. We just need to get to the tower now, Naruto quickly supplied, sliding the scrolls back into his jacket and picking up Sakura. Awkwardly, he swung her limp body onto his back, a chill going down his spine at how cold she was. Sasuke took one look at him before nodding quickly. All right, let's go. It took more time than Naruto would have liked to cross the distance to the tower, a few hours at least. In his hyper-aware state, thanks to losing his puppets and feeling extra vulnerable, he made sure to stick clear of anything that might be an ambush. His extreme paranoia managed to get them to the tower without interference, letting both boys release a sigh of relief as they crossed the threshold into a warm, barren room. Between them, it didn't take long to solve the riddle, and soon, after a large puff of smoke, they found none other than Iruka in front of them. The man had a proud smile on his face as he took them in, only to frown as he spotted Sakura hanging on Naruto's back. Is Sakura okay? Do we need to get her to a medical Nin? Eyes widening imperceptibly, Naruto quickly shook his head, forcing an apologetic smile onto his face as he pulled down his hood. No need, Iruka-sensei. Sakura-chan is fine. Sasuke looked across at him strangely, wondering when his blonde teammate had become so familiar with Sakura. But I gave her a rather delicate cocktail of drugs when she took a nasty injury, so I think the med Nin will do more harm than good if they try to treat her, you know? Iruka looked worried, but Naruto dissuaded his concerns with a dismissive shake of his hands. It's nothing serious, sensei, but she's going to need a lot of rest, so can I get her to the rooms? Iruka nodded slowly, a frown on his face as he began walking with the 2 out into the tower proper. Are you absolutely sure, Naruto? You don't want the medics to look her over? The boy just smiled disarmingly, hefting Sakura up a little higher as the girl began to slide down his back. Come on, sensei. You know I learned a lot of medical techniques during my time in the academy. I know exactly how to treat her. Plus, this is a survival exercise, right? There won't be any convenient medic Nin out on real missions. Again, Iruka nodded slowly, the troubled expression not leaving his face, which left Naruto to bring out the big guns. It's okay, sensei. She's my teammate. I won't let anything bad happen to her. Finally, the academy instructor's features softened and he gave a small, encouraging nod. Well, all right then. But if she hasn't recovered by the end of the remaining 4 days, then bring her to the medics, okay? Naruto nodded enthusiastically as the Chunin finally left them alone to find the rooms. Sasuke was still giving him slightly odd looks, but he must have been too tired to care as he quickly separated into one of the suites, allowing Naruto to slip into one of his own, a double, and breathe a sigh of relief. Carefully, he lay Sakura down on the bed before walking over and unsealing Kin's body and laying it on the one across the room. At least Sensei would be proud I managed to get 2 girls into bed. Naruto murmured to himself humorlessly as he wished, and not for the first time, that he had a clue what he was doing. Naruto didn't do much in that first day. He spent a good hour simply staring at the two corpses occupying his room. Before sealing them back up, he felt sick. He wandered the tower instead, trying to keep his mind very much off the two sealed bodies he had with him. That didn't really accomplish much either, although it did allow him to overhear two Chunin talking about the fact that there may not be any preliminaries this year, given the way the examinee teams were trickling in slowly. Apparently, only 3 teams, including Team 7, had made it in so far. Naruto did his best to avoid them. He tried to go down to the canteen on one of the lower levels, but only ended up picking at his food, his appetite quickly leaving him as he poked at his meat. Go figure, cooked animal flesh just wasn't really doing it for him right now. Maybe if he thought of the corpses as nothing but animals, it would make all of this easier? For some reason, the thought only made him queasy. Not to mention, he just couldn't rationalize his teammate away as some kind of cattle. The Oto Kunoichi, on the other hand. After a good few hours of agonizing over it, he was back in his room, staring at Kin's body laid out over the bed. He had removed the mattress, so she was lying on the hard wooden support underneath. He figured that would make things easier. Sakura was still sealed up. He just couldn't deal with her right now. He might make a mistake that he couldn't fix. Then again, this whole lie felt like a huge mistake already. But what was he supposed to do? Run to the Hokage and tell him that he lied about his teammate's death just so he could advance in the Chunin exams? That he had already considered desecrating her body for the same reason? He shook his head firmly, focusing on the other girl for the moment. He slowly turned his head back to her, properly examining her for the first time since collecting her body. Oh, sure, he had looked at them, but he had never properly examined her. It almost reminded him of the dead bird he had used as inspiration for Hang. For a while he simply moved her body about, lifting her arms, flexing her joints, turning her head this way and that. For a minute, he even satisfied a mild, childish curiosity he had regarding the female body, before realizing just what he was doing. He was sick moments later, the full brunt of his actions finally slamming into him. Even so, he returned to examining her body a few minutes later. After being sick, he felt a little better, as if simply acknowledging his actions had made it that much easier. He felt detached from the situation almost, as he were simply guiding his body instead of actually living it. It was almost as if the impending deadline of the body's rigor mortis was pressuring him to act. His mind became clinical, listing quickly through the things he would have to do to turn a human body into a workable puppet. It was almost like a mental game, and that was what he turned it into. He had to. First, he had to break the joints, disconnecting the major skeletal muscles from the bones so that he could install his own joints in their place. He would have to remove the internal organs as well, as they were simply wasted space now. He would have to drain the blood, so if it was cut there would be no evidence as to its origin. To further prevent this, he would have to reinforce both the skin, the muscles, and the skeleton with the special resin he used on his puppets to increase their durability. It was effective at absorbing into and strengthening any kind of material it touched, as he had found out when he was younger. He had been out on his balcony, trying to air out his apartment after blowing up another vial of liquid poison only to find it had a mildly corrosive property when introduced to wood. He had watched it eat away at his balcony's railing, but for some reason not in certain areas. He had discovered that a tree that grew close by to his apartment dripped sap onto his balcony. Wherever the sap touched, the wood became resistant to the corrosion. Not only that, but it became vastly stronger, less likely to break, chip, or be cut. When Naruto distilled the sap into a resin, the effects only increased. He knew what he had to do, but as he looked down at the body, the paling flesh a few inches from him, his hands only shook. He couldn't. His body refused to do anything. And again, he sat there, and he just looked, as if he could make all these things happen without having to touch her. Then, as though some invisible switch had been flipped in his mind, his hands began to move without him realizing it. They moved numbly through familiar, worn hand seals for a simple direct wind technique he used to cut wood into shape. Then, eyes glazed and not entirely focused, he breathed out, cutting a single straight line down Kin's torso. There was less blood than he would have imagined. It was like he was on autopilot, simply checking things off a list as he did them. His hands moved autonomously as his eyes drifted lazily about, sightless and dull, but clinical in their approach. He worked tirelessly through the night, not caring when he felt the first calls of sleep pull at the back of his mind, not paying attention when his stomach growled for food. There was only his hands and the body in front of him, not a human, just an incomplete puppet. There was a ticking in the back of his mind, and he knew it wouldn't go away until it was complete, until he finished her. It was only when it was all over, when he could finally look down at his hands and actually see the blood on them, that reality snapped back into focus. His breath, like it had been stolen from him for a few minutes, suddenly snapped back into his lungs as he let out a stifled gasp, falling backwards onto the floor and just staring at his blood-soaked hands. Kin looked at him from her now upright position, staring down at him with glassy eyes, mocking him with her now permanent smile. "Oh, Okami." Naruto couldn't look away. His eyes were fixed on her motionless form. She just sat there, waiting for him to use her. Naruto immediately rolled over, emptying his stomach on the floor again and retching until there was nothing left to expunge. His hands gave out from under him, and he rolled back onto his back, lying next to his own vomit and staring up at the ceiling. Except he wasn't seeing it. All he could see was Kin's smiling face, still waiting. He felt something warm on his cheeks only to realize he was crying. He wasn't sure when he had started. He spent the rest of that night curled in on himself in the corner, unwilling to look up because he knew she would be sitting there. She was unable to close her eyes after all. She would always be looking. However, his eyes did drift to the scroll in his pocket. Each time they did, he felt bile rising in his throat. He couldn't, not again. Kakashi arrived on the final day of the second exam in a good mood. Why shouldn't he be after all? The new Ika Ika sequel was slated for release in a week. His cute little Jinin had managed to pass in a single day, which earned him quite a bit of money off the bets the Jounin sensei had made. Best of all, he hadn't had to deal with his team's interesting dynamic for a whole 5 days. Yeah, everything was coming up Hataki. That was why he wore his signature eye smile as he alighted amongst the other sensei on the balcony in the lowest level of training ground 44's tower. Naturally, he was almost an hour late, so the Hokage had already finished with his speech and the Chunin candidates were making their way up to the balcony. "How are we doing, my cute little students?" he asked, far more chipper than he had any right to be. Much as he expected, he was immediately blanked by all 3 of his Genin. Sasuke walked right past him with a small grunt of acknowledgement, hands in pockets. Naruto simply slid by like a ghost, hood up and goggles over his eyes. His features were far colder than Kakashi remembered seeing them. Surprisingly, Sakura was the same, slipping by him with her head down, her hair rather messy and falling across her face. Her eyes were half-lidded and she looked tired. "Are you okay, Sakura?" Kakashi inquired congenially, his genuine concern not quite reaching his voice, making him come off flippant and insincere. Sakura simply sighed and leaned on the banister, letting her head droop slightly as she looked down at the arena floor with half-lidded eyes. "I'm okay, sensei. Just a little tired," the girl replied drowsily. Kakashi nodded with another eye smile, turning away to chat to some of the other sensei and never noticing how some of the tension seemed to just dissipate from Naruto's shoulders. All eyes turned to the front of the room where the electronic board had finished cycling through names, stopping on Lee, the spandex-clad boy from before, and another Konoha ninja that was older than them. Apparently, the Chunin Naruto had overheard had been wrong. There were enough candidates for a preliminary round. There were 16 remaining Chunin prospects in total. All the rookie teams as well as Team 9 had made it through. There was also an older Konoha team from which 2 members had quickly dropped out due to injuries, leaving only Lee's current opponent. There was also the Sand team with the redhead Naruto had noticed before, as well as a second Suna squad. They had dropped out almost immediately, sending wary glances at the redhead the entire time. It didn't exactly make Naruto any less cautious of the boy. The first fight of the preliminaries was disappointingly quick, with Lee showing incredible prowess in taijutsu. His opponent, the only older Konoha genin to make it this far, was attempting to use what appeared to be a chakra-draining technique on the bowl-cut boy. For whatever reason, it didn't appear to have any effect on Lee, allowing him to mop up his opponent with brutal and efficient taijutsu. It ended with his opponent in a crater on the ground and a touching, if not highly disturbing moment between Lee and his sensei. Naruto might have mistaken them for some horrible cloning accident if they hadn't been informed otherwise by their sensei, who seemed suspiciously desensitized to the whole display. The names began to cycle again, and Kakashi's attention was promptly diverted as Sakura pulled on his flak jacket. "Sensei, do you mind if I rest a little?" the pinkette asked in that same subdued voice from before. She really did look tired. "Can you wake me up when my match is called?" Kakashi had been informed that she was injured during the second exam and had required treatment, but didn't know the extent of it. He simply gave the girl a nod, to which she returned a thankful smile, before moving over to the wall of the balcony and sliding down into a sitting position with her legs tucked up against her chest. Her head dropped down, and within moments it looked as though she was asleep. Kakashi simply smiled, thinking she must have stayed up worrying about the third task. He couldn't think on it any longer, though, as one of his students was finally called up. He gave Naruto an encouraging pat on the shoulder as he walked by, but the boy didn't even seem to notice it. If Kakashi hadn't known any better, he would have said even Naruto looked more tired than usual. But with the permanent shadows under that boy's eyes, not to mention the concealing goggles, it was difficult to tell. Of course, his thoughts were immediately derailed by a far more exuberant pat on his own back, courtesy of Mato Guy himself. "Isn't this excellent, Kakashi, my friend? We are able to watch our own students pit their flames of youth against one another. Is there a more joyous sight?" Kakashi looked past the crying man to note that it was indeed Guy's student Naruto was paired up against. Down on the arena floor, Tintin was bouncing up and down on the balls of her feet, an excited gleam in her eye as her fingers moved restlessly. It was in stark contrast to Naruto, who stood there more akin to a statue than a living organism, his body motionless as he waited for the proctor to begin the match. As soon as the arm came down, Tintin sprang into action by launching a lethally precise salvo of kunai at the blonde. Naruto didn't even move, and a moment later every single kunai hit home, except they passed right through the younger boy as his body faded away. Tintin's eyes widened as she realized she had been fooled by a clone before whirling at a voice. "I hope you don't mind being used as somewhat of a guinea pig, but I am used to this particular puppet in a fight." Naruto's dull, lifeless tone drifted across the arena from seemingly no one place, forcing Tintin's eyes to dart about to locate him. The audience were confused too. It may take me a moment to get used to it. Before any of them resorted to using Dojutsu to locate him, he emerged from the floor, seemingly melting out of it, which caused Kakashi's eye to widen. He had never taught Naruto the subterranean voyage technique. One particular occupant in the room was staring at the boy like he had grown a second head. Kankuro was telling himself that he had to have heard wrong. There was no way the boy had said he was using a puppet. "I haven't even named her yet, although I'm leaning towards Kane," Naruto intoned tiredly, creeping Tintin out as he reached for a scroll in his jacket. She was about to stop him with another barrage of weaponry, only to catch movement out the corner of her eye. She turned on a dime and instead released her kunai on the Naruto behind her, only for it to be revealed as a clone, simply as a distraction. It bought Naruto enough time to unseal Kin's body, although it would have been unrecognizable as such to most. Gone was the naturally pale skin tone, instead dyed a deeper beige by the resin, giving her an almost tanned appearance. Her skin appeared unnatural and shiny, looking more synthetic than normal flesh, which of course was the point. Her previously neatly tied hair was let loose, scattering like a billowing black shroud around the puppet and partially masking her face. However, what could be seen showed dark, glassy eyes of a pure obsidian black, as well as a permanent smile seemingly carved into her face by way of her articulated jaw. Up in the spectators' balcony, 3 of the Suna Shinobi present gaped at the sight, not quite able to believe their eyes as they saw genuine Sunagakure puppeteering techniques used by a Leaf Nin. Not only that, but the boy was a mere genin whose sensei was known to be Kakashi of the Sharingan, who was certainly no puppeteer. Kankuro especially was glaring down at the boy, his fingers digging into the balcony's railings until his knuckles turned white. Down in the arena, Tintin wasn't doing much better, staring at the human-like puppet in confusion. Kin, or Kane, began going through a range of test motions, from flexing her arms and legs to taking a few tentative steps forward, her unsettling expression never changing. Not that it could. The puppet itself was wearing a set of Naruto's clothing, as he had little else on hand, which meant a fishnet shirt with a vest thrown over, buttoned up of course. All of the clothes looked tattered and worn, like they had been intentionally ripped, which they had been. It only served to raise the creepiness the human facsimile gave off as Naruto stood behind it, face like it was carved out of stone. "Okay, now I'm ready," Naruto said, after a few moments of deafening silence. It snapped Tintin out of her confusion as a menacing grin overcame her lips. "You better be dull, boy." From the stands, Kankuro gave an indignant yell, only to realize that for once the insult was not aimed at him. He went back to scowling at the hooded blonde. Naruto, on the other hand, ignored the taunt, focusing on the way he moved his fingers. Controlling Kin was like controlling no other puppet he had ever created or used. In a way, though, she was exactly like the puppets he used, although it took him long enough to figure that out once had gotten over her creation in the first place. Since then, Naruto had felt an odd detachment from himself and the things he did, like they weren't really his own actions. He controlled his puppets by using controlled bursts of chakra sent along his threads by way of specific finger movements or combinations. These activated and manipulated the seal arrays strewn through the puppets, which in turn controlled specific processes of the puppet. Kin was different. Using her felt wrong. She wasn't his puppet. It was more like he was forcing her body into position than guiding it there. However, it was the same principle. He found he could actively control her chakra network in the same way he controlled the seal arrays in his own creations. The chakra network was like the most complicated sealing array Naruto could have ever devised, forcing him to simplify it into more usable tasks and commands through gestures and motions. That was another thing that Naruto felt was wrong with using a human puppet. Not only did he not create it, so he knew nothing of its full intricacies, but it felt like he was soiling it. He was bastardizing such a beautifully complex and detailed piece of art into ugly, simple tasks that were just beneath it. Naruto felt that reducing humans to puppets was inherently insulting. The complexity of a human was what he should be aiming for in his puppets. Beggars could not be choosers, and Naruto had little other choice but to use what he had on hand. Tintin learned this the hard way as she began to launch barrage after barrage of seemingly endless kunai, and that was coming from a puppeteer who knew a little something about improbable supplies of weaponry. Kin was always right there, arms raised to deflect every single attack with her reinforced arms. She moved much faster than when she was alive, thanks to both Naruto's skill and her sudden lightness. Her movements were noticeably jerky, though, showing Naruto's inexperience dealing with this form of puppetry. All the same, she was an adequate shield for even the heaviest rain of kunai and shuriken, and as long as she was there to intercept every barrage, it mattered little how lethally accurate Tenen was. He had to hand it to the girl, though. She began to get creative quickly, using kunai to actually deflect the paths of other mid-air projectiles in order to try and blindside him. Of course, Kin was easily maneuverable enough, and he always kept her close to him enough for it to not become an issue. Even as the match progressed, it was obvious to see he was becoming more and more comfortable with her use. Her movements became more fluid and his defenses more creative. It was only when Tintin finally seemed to run out of her innumerable weapons and was reaching for a scroll that Naruto turned to the offensive. From personal experience, he knew allowing an opponent to retrieve a scroll for any reason was usually a mistake. The Odo team learned that well enough. Kin suddenly darted forward, moving at speeds Naruto himself couldn't have matched, and was suddenly within Tenen's guard, shocking the girl and forcing her to jump back. It was too late, though. The damage was done, as evidenced by a thin red line suddenly appearing under her torn Chinese-styled shirt. "You might want to forfeit the match within the next few seconds," Naruto suddenly called out, still in that droll monotone as he had Kin return to his side, confusing his opponent when he failed to press the offensive. Tintin simply looked at him like was crazy. She had barely even felt the scratch under her chest, and he wanted her to forfeit? Up in the stands, Sasuke placed his face in his hands, knowing what Naruto had done and already knowing the match was over. Most of the spectators, on the other hand, looked just as confused as Tintin. However, Kankuro was still fuming, perhaps even more so than before. "Buffed kid, I don't know what kind of opponents you've faced before, but if you think a little scratch like this will, why?" Tintin suddenly trailed off as her eyelids drooped. A burning sensation was spreading out from her stomach, numbing her body and causing her mind to become fuzzy. She valiantly hung on for all of 4 seconds before her body slumped uselessly to one side, the scroll she had been holding rolling away from her. Naruto walked over to her prone body, flipped a small syringe out of his pocket with a small flourish, and quickly stabbed it into her stomach, just below the cut. Then, as the onlookers watched on with a mix of confusion and shock, he simply walked up to his spot on the balcony. Then, as the proctor got over his surprise and actually called the match, it was like some kind of barrier had been withdrawn that had been holding the tongues of the spectators. The rookies clamored to their sensei to work out just what had happened while Guy and his mini-me were quick to recover Tintin's unconscious form, shouting about her fiery youth or something along those lines. It was the Suna team that was the most vocal as Kankuro glared across at the stoic blonde. What the hell is this? How does a Konoha brat know puppeteering? The kabuki-painted boy gestured across the arena angrily with one hand while the other reached towards the large wrapped bundle on his back. Even the boy's sensei, a tall man wearing a veil over half his face and the standard Suna Jounin attire, was looking over at the Hokage. What is the meaning of this Hokage? The stocky man called out, his visible eye narrowing dangerously at the older man. Even as the room broke out into clamoring and no one person could hear their thoughts over the noise, the Hokage simply stood there, his gaze neutral as he gently puffed on his pipe like he was sitting in his office and not standing atop a potential international incident. Quiet down, Anko suddenly yelled, her eye twitching in annoyance as she projected her voice with chakra to the point where some of the genin were forced to cover their ears. There was immediate quiet, allowing everybody to hear as Hiruzen cleared his throat softly and turned to the purple-haired proctor with a small smile. Thank you, Anko-chan. The woman simply beamed that murderous smile as the aged Kage turned back to address everybody assembled. Now, I understand that there may be some issues that may need to be addressed. However, I believe that these concerns can surely wait until after the preliminary rounds are over. I would be more than happy to use my time to assuage any concerns the Sunagakure delegates may have in my office, not while in the presence of those it does not concern. Sending a neutral gaze around the room, the Hokage finally nodded when he saw everybody was settled. Now, Hayate-kun, if you would. He motioned to the sickly-looking man who had been handling the preliminaries so far, who coughed into his hand at the sudden attention. Ah, right, Hokage-sama. Well then, the next contestants will be. He looked up to the cycling screen as it finally came to a rest on 2 names, one of the boys in question immediately gulping. Akamichi Chuji and Uchiha Sasuke. Both boys descended to the arena floor, one with a great deal more hesitance than the other. However, the match's outcome might as well have been preordained. It didn't even look like Chuji wanted to be there, but nevertheless they all watched him go through the motions. Predictably, it was over in a flash. Choiju just couldn't keep up with Sasuke's speed and was on the ground groaning within the minute. Sasuke just left the arena looking unsatisfied and irritated by the lack of challenge. He never noticed the way that the Hokage and Anko had been staring at him intently, as if searching for something that wasn't there, and it confused them as to why not. Anko in particular continued glancing at him every so often, rubbing at her neck as she did so. Was what she had been told a lie? Everybody's attentions were diverted as the electronic board once again came to a stop on the next 2 names. Sakura. The pinkette raised her head groggily to look up at her sensei, who simply motioned with his head to the board. Looks like you're up. Knock him dead, Kakashi encouraged with a bright eye smile. The way his genin were going, he was going to easily beat the other jounin with their bets. Already he had been sending sly looks at both Guy and Asuma, as their genin were summarily trumped by his own without much issue. Of course, he couldn't exactly claim to be the reason they had done so, what with Sasuke being a prodigy by his own right and Naruto having learned all his skills by himself. But hey, they didn't need to know that. Plus, it looked like Sakura had gotten her best possible pairing. Well, forehead, looks like it's me and you, Ino exclaimed with an absent flick of her head, a confident smirk alighting on her features. I'm not even all that surprised. It's just another opportunity for me to show Sasuke how much better for him I am. Sakura, on the other hand, simply sank into a ready position, her messy hair covering most of her face save for a half-lidded eye. Can we just get started? Her tired voice sounded out, causing Ino to frown before simply rationalizing it away as some kind of fake-out tactic. Sakura wouldn't get the drop on her so easily. Up in the balcony, Kakashi sent a glance to both his other genin, noticing them both watching the match intently, even if neither of their faces showed much of any emotion. He was rather proud of his students. For each of their individual matches so far, the others had watched on supportingly, save Sakura of course, but he could understand if she was drained and a little shell-shocked from the forest. Still, he only imagined it would serve to make her tougher in the future. On that note, the proctor finally decided to start the match. Before Ino could launch into another short monologue, Sakura dashed forward with speed that surprised the blonde. The Pinkette certainly hadn't been this fast leaving the academy. Up with the spectators, Kakashi grinned under his mask. It was already looking like another easy win. Ino brought up a kunai in time to divert Sakura's, which the girl had flipped out of her holster with an unusual flourish. There was a brief stalemate between the two as Sakura tried to drive the kunai down while Ino held her back. "What's the matter, forehead?" Ino managed to grind out between gritted teeth. "When had Sakura become so strong? Do you need to go all out to begin with because you know you have no chance to beat me otherwise?" She managed to divert the weapon away from her and jump back with a flip, only to find Sakura charging her down again. She launched a flurry of shuriken, only a few of them on target, but Sakura slid under them without much difficulty. Even with her hair covering a lot of her face, she seemed to have an excellent awareness of the arena. Then, suddenly, they were close again, engaging in a medium-paced bout of taijutsu. It was quickly shown Ino was the faster and more flexible of the two. However, Sakura was stronger and didn't even seem to notice half the blows that landed. They seemed very evenly matched. The silent taijutsu match continued on for another minute, with neither girl gaining any kind of advantage over the other until Ino suddenly found an opportunity to slip her hand into her pouch. It came back out with a few shuriken held between her knuckles, which she quickly slashed up with. Sakura was quick to respond, bringing her arms up to cover her face, only for Ino to smirk in victory as she left 3 small gashes up the girl's forearm. Sakura leapt back to make room, her face twisting into a pained expression a moment later, although the delay wasn't noticed by anybody but Ino, who was busier with other things. "How's that feel, forehead? Ready to forfeit yet?" Ino called out smugly as Sakura gripped at the bleeding wounds, her face still twisted into an expression of annoyance. She said nothing though, simply reaching over and tearing off one of her short sleeves to use as a makeshift bandage. Ino grimaced at that, resetting her stance as the two rushed towards one another. Another bout of taijutsu ensued, but it was clear Sakura was favoring her uninjured arm, and Ino was quick to take advantage, showing taijutsu wouldn't work for the Pinkette. She jumped back at the same moment Ino let loose with a handful of kunai that were right on target. Of course, they were rather slow and would have been simply to dodge, but that was the point. Ino was only trying to drive Sakura towards the wall so she could finish this with her now superior taijutsu. That might have been how it went if Naruto's fingers didn't suddenly twitch in a very different way. All at once, a multitude of things occurred. Sakura made to dodge, only to place her foot right on one of the discarded kunai from Tintin's fight with Naruto earlier. Ino's eyes widened in alarm as the kunai neared, Sakura suddenly unable to dodge as her ankle twisted and she stumbled. There was a wet squelch and numerous small thudding noises before the entire arena went quiet save for the single sound of Sakura's body falling to the floor. Then there was a flurry of activity. Kakashi leaped the railing and ran to his student at the same moment the medic Nin rushed onto the scene, looking over the girl's body frantically. One didn't have to be a medic Nin to know that a kunai through the heart, another through the neck, and a few more over various places in her body was not a good thing. Even as they rapidly moved her onto a stretcher, their faces were grim. Ino slumped to the ground, her eyes wide and unseeing as she truly contemplated what she had just done. Kakashi was much the same, staring after the girl's limp body as she was carried out with a wide eye and mildly trembling hands. He was whispering something to himself, but nobody could hear him, not that they were trying. Immediately, the Jounin sensei of the rookies were turning to their students, reassuring them that Sakura would be fine and they didn't need to worry. Ino was gently led away from the arena floor by her sensei, while the entire arena was restored to some modicum of calm. Shock hung like a blanket over the room. For one hooded blonde, the only sound that could be heard escaping his lips was a quiet, relieved sigh. His face showed the adequate shock that would be needed. After all, he only had to dredge up the memories of how he first found Sakura, and his features naturally realigned themselves. Internally, he was roiling with emotion. Part of him was disgusted for what he had just had to do. Another part, though, that only increased his disgust, was actually slightly proud that he had managed to accomplish it. Learning from Kin's body that he could manipulate her movements through her chakra circulatory system directly was a godsend. If he manipulated it in the right way, then he could cause any bodily function to restart without a command from the brain. In that way, he had kept Sakura's heart pumping and her lungs breathing long after death. For all intents and purposes, Sakura had been alive for the last few hours. The medics would find nothing amiss with her death. However, as Naruto saw Kakashi walk back up the stairs to them, his face blank and indecipherable, he felt a stabbing sensation in his chest he couldn't explain. Kakashi-sensei? That would be the first emotion other than irritation or amusement Kakashi had ever heard from the young puppeteer, and it barely even registered. Is Sakura going to be okay? Naruto asked quietly. The look he got from the man in return was all he needed to see, and he quickly slumped against the wall, his face almost copying Kakashi's blank mask, feature for feature. While it was mostly an act, the confusion he felt inside was all too real. Now it was over. What was he supposed to feel? What did he feel? There was a 20-minute reprieve given to the contestants after Sakura's death, allowing them time to both come to terms with what had happened, and for a small team of Chunin to adequately clear the arena of both debris and blood. It was mostly silent in the large room save for the sounds of the cleanup crew working and a few hushed whispers. Only the sand team seemed particularly unperturbed with the development, uncaring for the loss of a single Konoha kunoichi, even if the sand and leaf were supposed to be allies. Finally, though, they couldn't put the proceedings off any longer, and the board began its inevitable cycle through the remaining names. Naruto. Kakashi started as he saw his student push off the wall he had been slumped against for the better part of the last 20 minutes. You don't have to force yourself to do anything. At some point over the break, Naruto had removed his goggles, letting them hang from around his neck so that Kakashi could see his stony blue eyes. It's fine, sensei. Everything about the blonde seemed muted all of a sudden. His tone, the way he stood, even his usually vibrant hair seemed dulled. I'm still a part of this competition, aren't I? He intoned slowly, as if testing each word before allowing them to roll over his lips without any real luster or emotion. Kakashi wanted to say something then, maybe a reassurance, perhaps a condolence. He might have even asked Naruto how he was feeling. However, the gray-haired Jounin had never been a paragon of emotional stability, nor of handling grief particularly well. In the end, he just nodded quietly and turned a dark eye on the arena himself as the board finally stopped on two names. Come on, Akamaru, let's just do this, Kiba growled as he stared across the arena at his opponent. His own voice lacked its usual unquenchable enthusiasm. The small white dog riding in his jacket gave a subdued yip of approval, having read the tone of the room. They hopped over the railing at the same moment Kankuro did, or Sabaku no Kankuro, as the board named him. Naruto wondered what he had to do to get an epitaph like that. It seemed rather generic for a Sunagakure shinobi. So, you're my opponent? Kankuro sniped, his features set into a scowl as one hand impatiently drummed against the wrapped bundle on his back. All that weight for a mutt. Oh, and his dog, of course. Kiba naturally fell for the taunt, brash and impatient hothead that he was, and growled something unintelligible that may or may not have been for the benefit of Akamaru more than the spectators. Naruto just sighed. He and the rest of the rookies knew an angered Kiba was both more and less dangerous. His attacks became wilder and more vicious, but they lost precision. That would be fatal if Naruto's suspicions over Kankuro proved true. The match was started and immediately Kiba bull-rushed his opponent without a second thought, going down on all fours like the dogs the Inuzuka were so linked to. Kankuro only seemed briefly startled by the burst of speed, Kiba appearing within his guard in only a few seconds. He leaned back, but obviously not enough to escape the reach of Kiba's suddenly clawed hands as they raked up his face, causing more than a few of the genin to wince. Kankuro only stumbled back, not even crying out in pain. It was quickly revealed why when his face crumbled away. Behind it lay a disturbing and decidedly wooden, three-eyed visage that suddenly began chattering in an unsettling manner. Naruto blinked as he saw the rest of the disguise fall away. At least his theory had been proven correct. There was another puppeteer at the exams. That was interesting. It lurched forward, looking to grab Kiba, which likely wouldn't have ended well given how many concealed weapons it likely held. Kiba was fast enough to jump back, not rash enough to engage the obviously unknown threat. Behind the puppet, Kankuro emerged from the wrapped bundle, confirming another of Naruto's suspicions at the same time. He was learning quite a bit already. As much as Sakura's deaths had confused and muddled his emotions, the chance to see a real-life Sunagakure puppeteer, even if he was only a genin, was a childhood dream of his. Naruto thought his decision was likely a bad one. Knowing Kiba, the Inuzuka would have left the bundle alone, quite happy to chase the puppet about every which way like a dog with a toy. Unless, of course, Kankuro could not control the puppet from within the bandages, in which case why begin the match like that? Unless it was some kind of quick substitution? Naruto's mind was awhirl with thoughts watching this battle. Heh, you use dolls like Naruto. This should be a piece of cake. Kiba's comment made both Naruto and Kankuro's eyebrows twitch simultaneously. Naruto had to fight down the urge to point out that every time he had successfully snuck a puppet into the taijutsu spars, Kiba had never once beaten him. Kankuro, and used to the Inuzuka's boastful ways, took a little more offense to the comment. Please, like you could ever call a cheap imitation like that real puppeteering. Kankuro responded, the sneer plastered over his features stretching out his stylized face paint. And it certainly isn't playing with dolls. Let me show you how it's really done. Naruto's brow twitched again, wondering why everybody suddenly felt the urge to insult him. Whatever, come on Akamaru, let's go. It at least seemed that Kiba had learned something from growing up with Naruto, to attack the puppeteer and not the puppet. In this open and coverless arena, a puppeteer couldn't hide, making them a sitting duck unless they had other means to defend or conceal themselves. It seemed Kankuro didn't, as evidenced by the look of shock on his face as both Kiba and Akamaru barreled towards him. It quickly turned into a smirk, though, as his fingers began to dance. Naruto wasn't sure why he had been expecting to understand the pattern of the other puppeteer's fingers. Maybe he was seeking validation for his own style through a pre-established one? In any case, the movement of Kankuro's fingers was complete gibberish to him. It was like trying to understand a new language the first time hearing it. It almost made the blonde feel silly for concealing his fingers with his too long jacket. But then, it did help to hide the ruse he pulled with Sakura's body. Something different swelled within him, pride. He had created an entirely new style of puppeteering separate from Suna's. Whether or not it was superior remained to be seen. Kankuro's puppet suddenly interjected itself between Kiba and the puppeteer, still chattering away in that irritating manner. Naruto briefly wondered if all Suna puppets did that. It was actually rather annoying. Various compartments opened up along the construct's barrel-like body. It certainly wasn't winning prizes for aesthetics, and began launching tightly packed bundles of Senbon. Again, the blonde was forced to wonder if that was a design choice. It was certainly more intimidating, but a wider spread increased the likelihood of contact. Perhaps Kankuro lacked faith in his poison? Naruto had often wondered what kind of chemical Suna could make, considering their landscapes severe lacking when it came to plant life. Seeing the viscous green liquid dripping off the metal implements as they clattered to the ground, Naruto hazarded a guess at animal venoms. In any case, Kiba and Akamaru, now bearing a startling resemblance to his master through the use of a special clone technique, were able to dodge the hail of weaponry by twisting their body abruptly until they resembled twin tornadoes. Getsuga, with a shared cry, man and dog sheared straight through the barrage of weaponry, taking out one of the puppet's 4 arms in the process. With a yank on his threads, which Naruto could occasionally see glinting in the light much to his amusement, the puppet jerked back over to its master. That was another thing bugging Naruto. The puppet had the uncanny ability to hover mid-air, as well as fly about at Kankuro's command. He desperately wanted to know how the boy was doing that, and whether or not it was a trait of Suna puppeteering or unique to that particular puppet. Kiba broke off his attack, the two spinning Inuzuka suddenly separating and ricocheting off the floor. It was a diversion, as the dog-like Jinin managed to slip a smoke bomb onto the ground, filling the area around Kankuro with a thick purple smokescreen. Almost immediately, Kiba started up his attack again, and soon the two rapidly spinning tornadoes were bouncing in and out of the smoke cloud. They left craters everywhere they hit, showing just how devastating the attack was. Naruto had never seen the attack before. It made him wonder when the rash braggart from the academy had grown up and become a serious contender for Chunin. Finally, Kiba skidded to a stop, Akamaru mirroring him on the other side of the cloud as the hinge finally wore off. The thick veil of smoke was finally dying down, and Kiba grinned victoriously as Akamaru bounded over to him with a happy bark. "Yeah, there's no way he's standing after that, boy," Kiba asserted, allowing the small white puppy to jump up on top of his head like the strangest hat ever. A chuckle broke through his reverie, the smoke finally clearing enough to reveal the puppet still standing at the center of it all. It was battered and missing two more limbs, but it was still operational, proven when Kankuro suddenly climbed out of its chest cavity. Naruto clicked his tongue in irritation. So he wasn't the only one to have thought of hiding within his puppet as a defensive measure. Figures. Huh. If you think Karasu would be destroyed from such a weak attack, then you're underestimating the Suna Puppet Corp, Kankuro asserted, a bit muffled due to the cloth he was holding up to his mouth. Kiba simply glared at the other boy as he motioned for Akamaru to hop down again. "It doesn't matter now that you've gotten out. Come on, boy, let's get him." When Akamaru only gave a whimper in response, the Inuzuka looked up worriedly. "What's wrong, Akamaru?" The dog slumped in his spiky brown hair, weakly trying to get up only to have his limbs fail him. A moment later, and Kiba felt the very same effects travel through his body, causing his limbs to feel like lead. Heh, it was too easy to slip some vaporized poison into that convenient smoke screen you provided, and you were gracious enough to throw yourself headfirst into it a few times too. You're just lucky I didn't use anything lethal, otherwise the pup there would have more than just a bit of trouble moving. Kankuro sneered, already walking back towards the stands, passing the proctor along the way. "Call it, the mutt's done for." Just like he said, Kiba only managed to stumble a few paces forward, glaring so hard that Kankuro almost felt it before falling forward. "B bastard," Kiba managed weakly, before passing out from the drug in his bloodstream. It only earned a derisive chuckle from Kankuro, who seemed more interested in sending challenging glances Naruto's way. The blonde gave the Suna puppeteer nothing back, staring forward with a stony face that betrayed nothing of his thoughts. He was more interested in what Kankuro had shown, intentionally or not, than any assumed challenge between the two. Yes, it would be interesting to pit his style against the very techniques that inspired him, but not his end goal. No, he had a much larger target than some fresh genin that was likely at the lowest rung in the puppeteer corp. Troublesome. Naruto glanced over, snapped out of his thoughts as Shikamaru lazily shuffled by, sending furtive glances over at his opponent. Said opponent scowled at everything as he vanished in a swirl of sand, reappearing down on the arena floor and following Shikamaru's slow progress to the floor with an intense gaze. It wasn't a particularly long or interesting match if Naruto was honest with himself. Gaara did show frightening control over the sand. He kept contained within his gourd, as well as what seemed to be some kind of automatic 360-degree defense. After a few minutes of Shikamaru testing Gaara's defense, finding out that Gaara could still direct his sand while restrained, and generally avoiding being pummeled into a bloody paste by the unrelenting beige cloud, he finally just raised his hand and surrendered. It was obviously a lost cause. Nothing he could do would reach Gaara. He wasn't fast or strong enough to breach the seemingly impenetrable sand, and it was fairly obvious that the longer he stayed in the arena with the clearly unbalanced Tsunejinin, the higher the chance that he wouldn't be leaving it. Gaara, for one, seemed particularly irritated he had been denied a satisfying conclusion to his fight, muttering to himself disconcertingly the entire way back to his spot on the other balcony. Naruto suddenly felt glad he had the length of the room separating him from that psycho. He couldn't imagine what would have happened had he tried to face the boy with only Kin as his puppet. Others seemed to share his opinion as more than a few unsettled glances were thrown Gaara's way. all ignored as the boy seemed more content to talk to himself and glare at nothing. Eep. A surprised squeak was the only sign Naruto got that another pair of genin had been chosen, before a vaguely bluish blur hurried past him nervously. The sand kunoichi, on the other hand, chose a more extravagant way of getting to the floor, vaulting the railing and landing with a flourish of the long metal object she carried. It seemed to be a common trait of the Suna team, carrying heavy objects as their weapons. Was Suna really that far behind on their sealing knowledge? I've heard of the Hyuga clan. Temari, as the board introduced her, started up, cutting off the proctor before he could begin the match. You're supposed to be undefeatable in close-quarters combat or something. Plus you have those funky eyes, right? Hinata shrank back on herself, her fingers coming up and pressing together nervously under the more confident Kunoichi's harsh gaze. I don't see it. All I see is a little girl playing ninja. The sandy-haired Kunoichi smirked and brought the massive metal bar around with a spin, opening it slightly to reveal it was a giant fan with a single blue circle inscribed on it. Well, don't worry, girl. You won't get close enough for that to be an issue. I can promise you, Temari stated with an arrogant smirk. The proctor simply looked over in annoyance as if asking if he could start the match yet. He did so, and as his arm descended, Temari was already in motion, bringing the fan around in a great swinging arc. From the balcony, Naruto watched on in interest. He had read up on a few different Suna styles alongside puppeteering, and he wondered how a fan user would compare with a Hyuga. Hinata at least wasn't immediately defeated. She managed to jump out the way of the initial blast of wind that would have easily picked up her body and sent it crashing into the far wall. It wasn't particularly graceful, and when she picked herself up, Naruto couldn't help but notice that she was sending furtive glances towards the section of the balcony holding Guy's team. It was a shame, really. Naruto was actually rather interested in the Byakugan from an objective standpoint. People could argue about Jujutsu all they liked, and whether or not the Sharingan was superior. In Naruto's eyes, it was no contest. The ability to see that far in every direction as well as through object and people in minute detail, it was a puppeteer's dream. He wouldn't have to stay so close to his puppets to control them, and it would make integrating more intricate systems far easier. Not to mention they could see through Jinjutsu, a personal bane of his and a weakness brought to his attention during his confrontation with the Odo team. It seemed that Hinata only just realized this as she got to her feet, facing Temari and shifting into some semblance of a stance. Byakugan. Her timid cry barely reached those leaning right up against the balcony like Naruto, but the change was significant. This time when Temari launched a wind blast, Hinata was able to see the chakra in it immediately, showing her the exact boundary of the blade-like projection of wind. Her movement was more fluid as she slipped around the blast. Motions that seemed ingrained deep in her muscle memory easily guided her around the next swing, and she was even able to slide under the third, more desperate and larger blast Temari sent when she saw her attacks were becoming less effective. Unfortunately, Hinata seemed hesitant to press any advantage she had, simply dodging the attacks instead of trying to move into a closer range, so her taijutsu would actually be effective. Again, she kept sending those nervous glances up into the crowd, causing Naruto to look over and see the other Hyuga, the one they had met before the first exam, glaring down at her. He returned to staring at Hinata intently, her movements fascinating him as he wondered just what she was seeing through those eyes of hers. Hinata's gaze slid over to him as she seemed to catch his intent look, blinking in surprise. The blonde wasn't exactly sure what happened at that moment, but it seemed for the better. Hinata appeared to reaffirm her stance, her eyes setting into a modicum of determination. Meanwhile, Temari finally seemed to realize her current tactics were ineffective and seemed in the process of opening her battle fan up more. Hinata finally pressed the attack, running forward in that brief lull between wind blasts. Temari swung wildly, but Hinata's hand glowed with chakra. A quick swipe down at the right moment cut a gap right through the wind blast, large enough for the petite Hyuga to slip through. Suddenly, she was right inside Temari's guard. Temari proved to be no slouch with her weapon in close combat. However, there was a reason Hyuga were so feared in taijutsu. It was little known, but because the Byakugan allowed them to actually see their opponent's chakra system, they were able to see the flow of their enemy's chakra, actually anticipating their movements somewhat. That, combined with the devastatingly efficient Jukin that could lock down the Tenketsu and prevent said chakra flow, made them nearly unsurpassed at close range. Only the Uchiha, with the Sharingan's predictive abilities, were able to keep up with them in taijutsu, and often, even that wasn't enough. The Jukin still proved superior here. Temari was caught off guard by Hinata suddenly diverting her fan to one side with an unexpected and well-placed palm strike. The fan swung wide, and for a fraction of a moment Temari's midsection was completely exposed. In that instant, Naruto was privy to what few had seen outside of the Hyuga compound and survived to tell about it. Hinata's hands moved as blurs, her pupil-less eyes darting about at the same speed as she closed one, then two, then four Tenketsu, all in a row. She didn't stop there, though, using Temari's shock and surprise against her as she took advantage of the girl's sudden immobilization to finish her off. "I'm not playing ninja," Hinata managed, some semblance of actual confidence managing to come through in her voice as Temari dropped to the ground, her face seemingly frozen in an expression of shock. Over on the balcony, Kankuro was in a similar state, not at all having expected his sister to be taken out with such apparent ease. Funnily enough, though, a moment seemed to pass before the events caught up with Hinata herself, her face blooming into a brilliant red as she suddenly shrank back in on herself. Sorry." She quickly bowed, leaving her teammates to groan quietly and Niji's glare to intensify. The timid Hyuga quickly hurried out of the arena. As she passed by Naruto, whose eyes still hadn't left the arena floor where Temari was being taken away, he swore he heard her mumble something like a thank you. He blinked, turning to ask her what she meant, only to see she had scurried off back to her teammates, a virulent blush adorning her cheeks as she did her best imitation of a turtle, with her jacket being the shell. He continued looking in her direction with a mild frown until he was suddenly shoved out of the way as Niji passed by him in the opposite direction. Naruto scowled in the older Hyuga's direction, but Niji barely even seemed to notice him, a firm grimace set on his usually impassive features. It was in stark contrast to his opponent as Shino too took to the arena floor, revealing nothing behind his high-collar jacket and reflective black lenses. Naruto had always had a sort of quiet respect for the passive Aburame. He was in the higher end of every subject in the academy, yet he was never loud or boastful about it. Of course, in this instance it didn't particularly improve his chances against his current opponent, a prodigy in his own right and the previous graduating class rookie of the year. Normally Naruto didn't take stock in such titles, but simply seeing the confident, disinterested way he stood and the calm, leveled glare he maintained with his faintly gray eyes, he knew Shino would be in for a tough fight. Wordlessly, the long-haired boy activated his Byakugan, an impressive feat by its own right at his age, and with what looked suspiciously like a calming breath, he allowed a smirk to take the place of his scowl. "You might as well give in now, Aburame. I can see every one of the Kakachu beetles swarming in your body, as well as the trap you were attempting to set up around me." A few of the spectators turned a little green at the knowledge there were insects inside of the Aburame, proven as a few scuttled out of what looked like tiny pores in his neck. However, Shino remained impassive, tightening his head slightly as the proctor raised his arm to initiate the fight. Seeing does not predicate being able to act. Shino intoned monotonously, adjusting his glasses until they reflected the ceiling lights ominously. Why? Because sometimes you cannot trust your eyes. When the hand descended, both boys immediately acted. Most were confused as Niji suddenly rushed in a seemingly random direction, Shino chasing after him. The Hyuga vaulted through the air, again seemingly without reason, only for the part of the floor he jumped to suddenly come alive with tiny, crawling insects. In a split second, his body whirled around, his movements infinitely more graceful and perfectly coordinated than Hinata's. His fingers lashed out at thin air only for Shino to suddenly phase into existence upon contact, flinching back from the finger strike. Across the room, the other Shino dissolved into a swarming black mass of Kakachu that immediately rushed to protect its master and hive. Niji didn't stop with a single finger strike. He was unrelenting as his narrowed eyes darted from spot to spot, picking out the minute Tenketsu that controlled his opponent's vital chakra flow. By the time he was done, Shino was on the floor, a look of obvious pain straining to get past his stoic facade as Niji poised 2 fingers above a spot on his shoulder. Surrender, Niji stated coldly, his fingertips humming with a faint blue glow that was obviously more a show of force than part of any necessary measures for the Jukin. One more strike, and I will have blocked off the necessary chakra required to control your swarm. They will literally eat you from the inside. Shino quickly complied, seeing he was both outclassed and sorely underprepared to face an opponent as ruthless as Niji. Obviously, being a teammate with Hinata hadn't helped him face a Byakugan user, but then Hinata wasn't exactly the paragon, nor even the standard of her clan. I always trust my eyes. They see everything. Aburame, Niji said as he walked away from the fight. Yet again, the loser needed to be carried out of the arena. It looked like Hinata wanted to rush and see her teammate, but at that moment the winners of the preliminary fights were all called down to the arena floor where the Hokage could address them. Congratulations all of you for advancing this far. In the final rounds of the Chunin exams, you will finally be allowed to place all your honed battle skills and disciplines on display. Naruto caught the Hokage glancing across at him for a split second, a strange expression on the old man's face for a brief instance. Accordingly, the final exam will take place 1 month from now. He waited for any kind of objections or comments, but they never came. The Genin simply stood waiting patiently, or in Hinata's case, trying to appear as small and unnoticeable as possible. Good. This should grant you sufficient time to come up with new battle strategies for your opponents, as they are no longer unknowns as they have been so far. It will also be a good opportunity to rest up, take stock of your own abilities, and evolve them accordingly. At that, Naruto had to fight down a small smirk. Evolving his abilities? Sounded good. Now, before we can continue, there is one more matter to attend. Everybody will need to take one of the pieces of paper from the box Anko here is holding. Said woman simply smirked in their direction, jiggling the simple wooden box she held and messing up the slips of paper inside. Hear that, kiddies? Just stay where you are, and I'll come along right up to you, okay? She wore a near-feral grin as she moved down the line of assembled genin until each of them had a slip. Naruto couldn't help but notice as he rummaged around in the box that Anko seemed to be eyeing him up intently, not even bothering to hide it. He glanced down at the slip in his hand, unfurling it to reveal the large and bold number 6. Looking down the line, he saw the other competitors had similar numbers in their hands. Good. The Hokage started, taking a long drag of his pipe rather unprofessionally, before continuing. If each contestant would call out their number then? He looked to the end of the line where Kankuro stood. 5. The Suna puppeteer stated gruffly. 1. A perfectly youthful number. I bet Gai-sensei would be proud. Lee called out exuberantly, everybody ignoring the boisterous reply from somewhere on the balcony. The Hokage quickly moved on before they could go anywhere. 8. Gaara stated after a moment, snarling at the piece of paper in his hands. It likely meant a late fight. 2. Sasuke drawled indifferently, his face a blank mask as it had been since Sakura's death. F4. Hinata squeaked nervously, looking along the line a bit further to where Niji suddenly gained a cruel and victorious smirk, having come to the same conclusion as Naruto had concerning the numbers. 6. Naruto intoned softly, nobody questioning his curt, almost whispered answer, similar to Sasuke. However, he too was looking down the line like Niji, eyeing up Kankuro with a gaze hidden by his goggles. 3. Niji finished, still staring intently at Hinata, who only seemed to shrink under his gaze. She suddenly seemed very glad for the buffer of Naruto between the two. The Hokage nodded as they finished, puffing on his pipe again and blowing out a wispy white cloud before continuing. And that leaves number 7 for Yamanaka-san. Good. Then the matchups are decided for the last round of the Chunin exams. Numbers 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, as well as 7 and 8 will fight one another to proceed further into the tournament. He raised a hand, preempting the questions he could already see percolating on a few of the participants' tongues. While the final exam will be in the style of a tournament, for the benefit of the visiting judges and spectators, not only the winner of the tournament will be allowed to become Chunin. In fact, even they may not make the rank. Again, he raised a hand, quietening the questions before they could be asked. During the tournament, you will be assessed on the qualities we believe Chunin should possess. This means that even if you were to be defeated in the first round, but still manage to showcase these traits, you will advance in rank. However, one who manages to win the tournament, yet display none of these qualities, will be as likely to fail as any of you. As of this point, all of you have the potential to be made Chunin. The Hokage nodded once at the assembled genin. Do your villages and your nations proud. And with those parting words, he left the genin to mill about or return to their sensei. Naruto took the opportunity to make for the door of the tower. He just wanted to get out of this forest as fast as possible. He felt like it would be a long month ahead of him. Already thoughts and ideas, inspired by what he had seen today alone, swirled through his mind. However, there was also the emotional turmoil he felt just beneath the surface he badly needed to sort out. In any case, some rest in the comfortable, familiar environment of his apartment would do him good. He needed to have puppets on hand that just weren't. Kin. As he passed through the door out into the forest, he was stopped by Kakashi rushing up to him. Naruto. Good. You didn't vanish, he said, causing Naruto to grumble in his mind. He had been about to. I wanted to talk to you about the month break. I arranged to have you trained by a Jounin instructor called Ebisu. Naruto blinked at that. Despite the cold, rather bland tone Kakashi was using, the Jounin was holding his emotions back well. That shows remarkable prescience considering we had no idea whether or not I would pass before today. Naruto drawled, matching Kakashi's bleak tone note for note. The gray-haired man shrugged like it was inconsequential. I had faith in my students. He smiled, although it seemed rather forced, and arranged training for all three of you, in case you needed it. I'll be taking Sasuke with me. We need him to unlock the Sharingan, and right now I'm the only one in the village with one. Ebisu is a private instructor who has trained a number of Chunin up to levels acceptable for Jounin. I'm sure he can find something to work on with you. Naruto paused, considering it for a moment. He somewhat remembered a man named Ebisu from his limited interactions with the Hokage's grandson. The man seemed not to like him very much. Thank you, but it won't be necessary, Naruto finally admitted quietly. I have a lot to work on by myself over the break if I am to be ready for opponents like Gaara, Neji, and Sasuke. An instructor who does not understand my discipline will only be a hindrance. Kakashi studied him for a moment before apparently finding something in Naruto's features the blonde personally didn't think was there. He nodded slowly with another strained smile. Okay, I understand. Sometimes it is better to be alone to deal with issues like this. He nodded again, this time more to himself than anything. Heh, I had to trade one of my rarer Ikas to Ebisu just to get him to agree, you know. So you owe me, alright? Naruto stared at the Jounin curiously for a few moments before nodding, albeit with hesitation. Even if he was sure the man was joking, Naruto didn't like to owe anybody anything. He turned to leave only to get stopped again. This time Kakashi's features were indecipherable. But if you need anything, Naruto, even if it's just to talk, you'll come see me, okay? Again Naruto paused before giving a slow, uncertain nod, earning a smile from the silver-haired man that seemed a little more genuine. With that out of the way, he left. Kakashi waited until the blonde was out of his sight and range of senses before he let out a sigh. He placed a hand on his forehead and slowly ran it through his hair, his posture slumped and despondent. Taking another minute to compose himself, which included wiping away the very beginnings of a tear trying to form in his visible eye, he turned back and headed for the tower. He needed to collect Sasuke. It was going to be a long month for everybody.
I hope you guys like the video. Please make sure to leave a like and subscribe my channel. Till then, take care.